You're going to be hated anyway, SOB the villain, they will misunderstand you. They will project their fears onto your silence. They will call you cold when you are disciplined. They will call you cruel when you finally choose yourself. No matter how carefully you walk, someone will still decide you are the problem. So what if the real trap was never becoming the villain, but spending your life trying to prove you weren't one? This is not a story about cruelty. It is a story about control. About power reclaimed in a world that feeds on your hesitation. Stay with me. This is where the mask finally comes off. If this message resonates, take a second to support the channel. Like the video, subscribe, and share it with someone who's tired of explaining themselves. The birth of the villain, it never begins with anger. That is the lie people tell themselves because anger is loud and this beginning is quiet, almost invisible. It starts in moments so small they barely register as pain. A favor given without hesitation. A boundary gently explained. A truth spoken softly, hoping it will be respected. And each time something is taken, not all at once, slowly, carefully, until one day you look back and realize you have been paying for your kindness with pieces of yourself. In the beginning, you believed being good was enough. You believed effort would be noticed, intentions would be understood, and patience would eventually be rewarded. You learned to listen more than you spoke. To give the benefit of the doubt, to smooth conflicts instead of winning them. You told yourself that strength meant restraint, that maturity meant swallowing discomfort so others could feel comfortable. And for a while, this belief felt noble. It felt clean. It felt right. But nobility has a cost when it is offered to people who see it as weakness. The first betrayal rarely looks like betrayal. It looks like a joke made at your expense, laughed off because you didn't want to seem sensitive. It looks like a promise broken, explained away with excuses you chose to understand. It looks like your time being taken for granted because you never complained when it was wasted. Each incident alone feels harmless. Together, they form a pattern, a quiet education, a lesson you never agreed to learn. You begin to notice how quickly people adjust to your generosity, how naturally they expect it, how surprised they are the first time you hesitate. The first time you say no, their faces change. Confusion first, then irritation, as if you violated an unspoken contract, as if your kindness was never a gift, only a service they assumed would always be available. That is when the erosion begins. You start editing yourself. You soften your words so no one feels challenged. You shrink your needs so no one feels burdened. You apologize for emotions that were justified, for questions that were reasonable, for boundaries that should have been obvious. Somewhere along the way, you learn that peace, as it is offered to you, requires your silence. And silence, when it is demanded, is not peace at all. They call you nice. But what they mean is manageable. The exhaustion doesn't arrive dramatically. It settles in your bones, a heaviness you carry even when nothing is happening. You feel it when you wake up already tired, when you replay conversations in your head, wondering how you could have said things differently, softer, better. When you feel responsible not just for your actions, but for everyone else's reactions. You start to realize that being good has become a full-time job with no rest and no protection. And still you try, because walking away feels like failure, because standing firm feels like cruelty, because you were taught that endurance is virtue and self-sacrifice is strength. You were never taught to ask who benefits from that belief. Then comes the moment that doesn't look like a turning point, but is. It is a small dismissal, a boundary ignored one too many times, a look of annoyance when you finally speak up, a subtle punishment for asserting yourself. And in that moment, something inside you goes quiet, not angry, not explosive, just clear. You understand without needing to argue it that your kindness was never misunderstood. It was understood perfectly. That is why it was exploited. This realization hurts more than rage ever could, because rage implies injustice. This feels like clarity. You see the pattern laid out in front of you, undeniable. The more you gave, the more was taken. The more patient you were, the more careless they became. The more forgiving you acted, the more entitled they felt. Goodness did not bring safety. It brought access. And society encourages this trade. You are praised for being agreeable, for being flexible, for being easy to work with, easy to live with, easy to overlook. You are told that real strength doesn't need recognition, that real power is quiet, that humility means accepting less without complaint. Slowly, subtly, you are trained to disappear just enough to make others comfortable. And when you resist even slightly, the language changes. You are no longer kind. You are difficult, no longer patient. You are cold, no longer generous. You are selfish. This is where the word villain first appears, not spoken aloud but implied, in tone, in distance. In the way people begin to treat you differently the moment you stop overextending. You haven't changed yet, not really. You've only stopped shrinking, and already that is enough to make you dangerous. The exhaustion reaches a point where maintaining the old version of yourself feels heavier than becoming someone new. You realize you are tired of proving your intentions, tired of explaining your boundaries, tired of absorbing damage quietly so others don't feel uncomfortable confronting their own behavior. You understand, finally, that the rules you were playing by were never designed to protect you. They were designed to contain you. And in that understanding, something irreversible happens. You don't decide to become the villain. You simply stop protecting a system that was never protecting you. You stop volunteering to be misunderstood. You stop performing goodness for people who only valued the performance. The mask doesn't fall dramatically. It is removed calmly, almost gently. And beneath it is not cruelty, but resolve. This is the birth, not of malice, but of refusal. The realization settles in slowly, but it changes everything. Playing nice was never safety. It was submission dressed up as virtue. And now that you see it, you can never unsee it. The refusal does not announce itself. It doesn't demand attention or validation. It simply exists, steady and unmoving, like a door that no longer opens no matter how politely someone knocks. At first, even you are surprised by it. You expect guilt to flood in, the familiar instinct to explain, to soften, to fix. But instead there is a strange calm, a quiet relief. As if your body recognizes this stance before your mind fully understands it. People feel the shift before they can name it. Conversations change. The pauses stretch longer. Your silence, once read as agreement, now lands differently. You are no longer rushing to fill space, to reassure, to make things easier. And in that absence, others begin to reveal how much they depended on your compliance, how uncomfortable they are without your emotional labor smoothing every edge. Some respond with confusion. They ask if you're okay, but not really. They are asking if you are still controllable. Others respond with irritation masked as concern. They suggest you've changed, that you're colder, harder, less fun. The irony is sharp. The moment you protect yourself, you are accused of becoming someone else. As if the version of you that endured quietly was the only acceptable one. This is where doubt tries to creep back in. You wonder if you are overreacting, if you are being unfair, if holding the line makes you the problem. Old habits don't die easily. They whisper that harmony is more important than honesty, that peace is worth any price. But now those whispers sound tired, outdated. You've lived their consequences. You know what they cost. You start noticing things you once ignored. How often your needs were postponed indefinitely. How often your discomfort was treated as an inconvenience. How rarely anyone checked whether you were okay as long as you were useful. These observations don't enrage you. They sober you. They strip away illusion. The villain, you realize, is not someone who harms others without reason. The villain is simply the one who stops absorbing harm quietly. There is a grief that comes with this awareness. A mourning for the person you were, the one who believed understanding could fix everything. The one who thought if they just explained themselves clearly enough, patiently enough, the world would meet them halfway. Letting go of that belief feels like letting go of innocence, because innocence is not ignorance, it is trust. And trust, once broken repeatedly, does not regenerate the same way. You feel this loss most sharply in moments of restraint, when you choose not to respond, not to justify, not to rescue someone from the discomfort of your boundaries. These moments feel unnatural at first, like learning to walk with a different balance. But with each one, your center of gravity shifts. You are no longer leaning outward, bracing yourself against others' expectations. You are standing upright, carrying your own weight, and that posture alone is enough to unsettle people. Some test you. They push gently at first, using familiar tactics, guilt, nostalgia, reminders of who you used to be. When that fails, the pressure increases. They accuse you of being selfish, of thinking you're better than everyone else, of losing your values. This is the cost of no longer being easy to exploit. When access is removed, entitlement reveals itself as anger. What surprises you is how little this shakes you now. Not because you are numb, but because you finally understand the pattern. You see how quickly affection turns conditional when compliance disappears. And instead of scrambling to repair it, you let the truth stand. If your worth only exists when you are convenient, then it was never real. This is the moment the internal shift completes. You stop measuring yourself by how well you are received. You stop interpreting resistance as failure. You begin to understand that being disliked is not always a signal of wrongdoing. Sometimes it is simply the echo of boundaries colliding with expectations. And that collision, uncomfortable as it is necessary. You are not cruel, you are precise. You choose your words carefully or not at all. You conserve your energy. You invest where there is reciprocity, not obligation. And slowly the noise fades. The need to be seen as good loosens its grip. In its place is something sturdier, self-respect. Not loud, not performative, just present. By now the label has formed fully in the background. Villain. Not because you harm, but because you no longer allow harm. Not because you dominate, but because you cannot be dominated the way you once were. You don't wear the title. Others assign it when they lose their leverage. And that is when the final realization settles in, heavy and undeniable. The rules were never fair. They rewarded those who took and punished those who endured. Playing nice was never protection. It was permission. Once you see that, there is no return to innocence. Only forward into something quieter, sharper, and far more dangerous than anger. Continue. Yes, the quiet that follows this understanding is not empty. It is dense, weighted. It presses in around you not with fear but with awareness. You start to see the world differently, as if a filter has been removed. Interactions feel slower now, more deliberate. You notice who speaks only when they want something, who listens only to reply, who disappears the moment you are no longer useful. These patterns were always there. You simply didn't have the distance to see them clearly. Distance changes everything. You no longer rush to fill silence, and in that pause, people reveal their intentions without realizing it. Some grow uneasy, fumbling for control. Others withdraw entirely, offended not by anything you said, but by what you refused to give. And then there are a few who remain steady, respectful, unchanged. You remember them, because consistency, you learn, is rare. There is power in this observation, but it is a lonely power. Because once you see clearly, you cannot pretend you don't. You cannot laugh at jokes that diminish you. You cannot agree just to keep the peace. You cannot unlearn the truth that many relationships were sustained not by mutual care, but by your tolerance. This is where the world starts to feel colder, not because you have become heartless, but because illusion once provided warmth. Belief softened edges. Hope blurred intentions. Without it, things appear as they are, sharper, cleaner, more honest, and honesty stripped of comfort feels brutal at first. You begin to understand why so many people choose to stay unaware, why they cling to narratives of fairness and goodwill even when experience contradicts them. Awareness demands responsibility, it demands choice, and choice demands consequence. Once you know, you must decide how much you are willing to tolerate going forward. You decide quietly. You stop chasing closure from people who benefit from your confusion. You stop explaining yourself to those committed to misunderstanding you. You stop offering access to anyone who treats it as entitlement. These decisions don't make you louder, they make you firmer. And firmness, unlike anger, does not burn out. Others feel it. They adjust their tone around you. Some become cautious, others become distant. A few attempt to provoke a reaction, hoping to pull you back into the old dynamic where you were predictable, reactive, manageable. But you don't take the bait. Not because you are afraid, but because you no longer need to prove anything. This restraint is misunderstood. They think you are plotting. They think you are holding grudges. They think your silence is hostility. The truth is simpler and more unsettling. You are at peace with letting people think whatever they need to think. Their perception no longer defines your posture. And that independence, more than any confrontation, shifts the balance of power. You feel it internally first, a steadiness, a reduction of inner noise. Decisions become cleaner when they are not filtered through the need for approval. You trust yourself more because you are no longer constantly betraying yourself for acceptance. This trust is quiet, but it is unshakable. Still, there is a cost. You miss the ease of being liked effortlessly. You miss the simplicity of believing everyone meant well. You miss the version of yourself that could walk into any room and feel welcome. But you also remember what that welcome required. The self-erasure, the constant adjustment, the unspoken rule that your comfort was negotiable. And you realize you do not miss that at all. The villain, you now understand, is not a mask you put on. It is the name given to you when you stop wearing the mask everyone preferred. When you step out of the role assigned to you without asking permission, when you choose alignment over approval. This is not transformation through force. It is transformation through clarity. And as this chapter of your life closes, one final truth emerges, unsettling in its simplicity. Once you stop needing to be seen as good, you become capable of something far more powerful. You become untouchable. The world will respond to this change, not immediately, not openly, but inevitably. And when it does, you will see just how threatening your self-control really is. When silence becomes a threat, silence used to scare you. Not the absence of sound, but the absence of reassurance. The fear that if you didn't explain yourself, didn't soften the moment, didn't clarify your intentions, something would be lost. A connection, an image, control over how you were perceived, so you spoke. You filled gaps. You defended truths that never needed defending. Now silence feels different. It is no longer empty space. It is weight. When you stop reacting, the world leans in. People are accustomed to feedback, to resistance, to emotion they can read and manipulate. Your quiet interrupts their rhythm. It removes their leverage. They can no longer predict you, and unpredictability makes people nervous, especially those who relied on your transparency to stay comfortable. You notice it in conversations first. How others keep talking, adding details you didn't ask for. How they circle a point, hoping you'll nod, interrupt, reassure them, but you don't. You listen calm, still, and in that stillness the balance shifts. They begin revealing things they never intended to say, justifying themselves, explaining motives, exposing insecurities. Silence, you learn, is not passive, it is a mirror. When you used to speak quickly, you were managing outcomes, managing feelings, managing perception. You thought this was maturity, but it was labor. Emotional labor you performed so others wouldn't have to face discomfort. Now that you've stopped, that discomfort has nowhere to go but back to them. Some people interpret this as distance, others as punishment. A few see it as arrogance. They ask what's wrong. They assume something must be wrong because your quiet no longer serves them. But nothing is wrong. You are simply no longer negotiating your presence. This is where silence becomes threatening, not because you are plotting, but because you are unmovable. You no longer rush to clarify misunderstandings that benefit others more than you. You no longer chase harmony at the expense of truth. If someone misinterprets you now, you let it stand, not out of spite, but out of self-respect. That restraint rewrites the dynamic. People accustomed to control feel it slipping. They try old tactics first. Casual comments meant to provoke a reaction. Subtle digs disguised as humor. Questions that are not questions, but hooks. You see them clearly now. And you decline to bite. Each non-reaction tightens something in the air. You realize then that silence is not absence. It is positioning. By saying less, you are seen more clearly. By reacting less, you gain leverage, not because you seek power, but because power naturally settles where there is control. Emotional control, temporal control, control over access to you. This control does not announce itself, it simply exists. And that existence forces others to adapt. Some grow respectful. They measure their words. They think before crossing lines they once stepped over casually. Others grow resentful. They preferred you expressive, reactive, explainable. They preferred knowing where they stood. Your silence denies them certainty, and uncertainty exposes intention. You start to understand something unsettling. People were never listening to your words as much as they were reading your reactions. Now that those reactions are gone, they are left guessing. And guessing makes people reveal who they really are. Silence sharpens your perception. You hear what is not said. You notice patterns instead of promises. You feel shifts in energy that words once drowned out. This awareness is quiet but relentless. It shows you which connections are built on respect and which were built on access. And for the first time, you don't rush to fix that realization. You let silence do its work. Because silence, when chosen, is not weakness. It is a line drawn without ink, a boundary enforced without violence. And those who relied on noise to cross it feel exposed. They begin to test the silence the way someone tests thin ice. Carefully at first, a message sent and left unanswered longer than usual. A comment dropped into the air, waiting for a response that never comes. They are listening now, but not for words. They are listening for cracks, for proof that the old version of you is still reachable if they apply enough pressure. You don't give it to them. What they don't understand is that this quiet is not something you are doing to them. It is something you have stepped into for yourself. Silence is no longer avoidance. It is selection. You are choosing where your energy goes, and more importantly, where it does not. Every moment you don't react is a moment reclaimed from a cycle that once drained you. This unsettles people who are used to emotional immediacy. Those who thrive on quick responses, on visible impact, on the reassurance that they can still move you. Your stillness denies them feedback, and without feedback, control slips. You see how often noise was used to blur accountability, how arguments escalated not to resolve truth but to exhaust it, how emotions were weaponized to rush decisions, force forgiveness, bypass boundaries. Silence removes that advantage. It slows everything down, and in that slower pace, intention becomes visible. Some people mistake your calm for indifference. They think you no longer care. The truth is more precise. You care too much to continue caring recklessly. You have learned the cost of unfiltered access. You have learned that not every emotion deserves expression, and not every situation deserves your voice. This restraint is a discipline. It takes effort to remain quiet when you know exactly what you could say, when you could dismantle an argument in seconds, when you could expose manipulation with a single sentence, but you don't. Because winning the moment is no longer your goal, protecting your position is, and position once established is powerful. You notice how people adjust around you now, how conversations become shorter, more deliberate, how jokes aimed at you disappear, how disrespect hesitates before landing. Silence has recalibrated the room, not through dominance but through unpredictability. People no longer know which version of you they'll get, and so they tread carefully. This is not fear, it is awareness. You are not trying to intimidate anyone. But you are no longer advertising your thoughts, your plans, your vulnerabilities. Privacy has become your armor. The less they know, the less they can use. The quieter you become, the clearer your priorities grow. And with that clarity comes something unexpected, peace. Not the fragile peace that depends on everyone else behaving well, but a grounded peace that exists regardless of how others act. Because your stability is no longer outsourced. It is internal, self-regulated, untouchable by provocation. This is where silence stops being a tactic and becomes a state of being. You don't rehearse conversations in your head anymore. You don't feel the urge to correct every misunderstanding. You let people believe what they want. Those who matter will see you clearly over time. Those who don't were never meant to have access anyway. The irony is sharp. The less you try to control perception, the more control you actually gain. People start projecting onto your quiet. They assume intention where there is none, strategy where there is only self-respect. They call it coldness because warmth once came easily from you and its absence feels like punishment. But you are not punishing anyone. You are simply no longer compensating for others' discomfort. Silence has taught you something words never could. It has shown you who panics when they lose influence, who becomes hostile when they lose access, who respects boundaries without needing them explained. These distinctions are priceless. They sort your world for you without confrontation, without drama. And slowly you begin to understand why silence has always frightened people more than anger. Anger burns fast. It reveals itself. It can be waited out, argued with, manipulated. Silence offers no such openings. It does not negotiate. It does not justify. It simply remains. In that remaining, something else happens. Time starts working in your favor. You are no longer reacting in real time. You observe, you delay, you choose your moments. And those who once rushed you now find themselves waiting, uncertain, off balance. The roles have reversed without a single word exchanged. This is the quiet power of non-reaction, and as it settles into your identity, you feel the final shift of this chapter taking hold. A realization that lands not as excitement, but as certainty. Silence is no longer something you use. It is who you are becoming. And those who relied on your voice to control the narrative are beginning to understand what they've lost. They begin to talk about you when you are not there, not because you did something, but because you didn't. Silence creates a vacuum, and people rush to fill it with stories. They guess at your motives. They assign meanings to your absence. They rewrite your calm into arrogance, your restraint into hostility. This is not an accident. When they cannot read you, they must reframe you in a way that makes sense to them, a way that restores their comfort. You let them. This is the part no one prepares you for. The moment when doing nothing feels like doing damage. When you hear fragments of what's being said. When you realize your quiet has unsettled the room enough that others feel compelled to explain you on your behalf. Old versions of you are dragged out, reshaped, repurposed. You could step in. You could correct the narrative. You could remind them of your intentions. You choose not to, because you understand now that clarity offered too quickly is another form of surrender. You are not responsible for managing other people's interpretations. You were never meant to be. That responsibility was placed on you because you accepted it once. You don't accept it anymore. And this refusal changes how power moves around you. Those who relied on your reactions to gauge their standing feel exposed. They begin to overcompensate, to speak louder, to act bolder, to provoke openly what they can no longer pull quietly. You see it happening in real time. The escalation, the impatience, the cracks in their composure. Silence has removed their mirror. Without your feedback, they don't know who they are in the interaction. And that uncertainty terrifies people who build their identity on influence. They try to force you back into motion. They mistake stillness for stagnation, not realizing it is momentum redirected inward. You remain unmoved. This is when the atmosphere truly shifts, not dramatic, not explosive, but undeniable. You feel it in the way rooms go quieter when you enter, in the way conversations pause for a fraction longer than before, in the way your presence alone now carries weight it never did when you were constantly accommodating. You haven't raised your voice. You haven't made demands. You haven't issued ultimatums. You simply stopped leaking energy. And the cost of that realization hits others harder than it hits you. Some distance themselves, unable to operate without emotional access. Some become openly critical, needing to frame you as the problem so they don't have to examine their loss of control. And some quietly adjust. They respect the boundary because they recognize strength when they see it. You take note of all of it, because silence doesn't make you blind. It makes you observant. You are learning the difference between presence and availability, between respect and familiarity, between being known and being exposed. These distinctions were impossible to make when you were constantly explaining yourself. Now they define your world. The most unsettling change, though, is internal. You are no longer afraid of being misunderstood. That fear once governed your behavior, shaped your tone, filtered your truth. Now it feels distant, almost irrelevant. You understand that misunderstanding is not always a failure of communication. Sometimes it is a refusal to accept boundaries, and no amount of explanation can fix that. This understanding hardens into something permanent. You no longer rush to defend your character. You let time do that work. You let consistency speak. You let absence teach lessons words never could. This patience is not passive. It is strategic. And strategy, once learned, does not disappear. As Chapter 2 draws to a close, one final truth settles in, heavy and unavoidable. Your silence has changed the rules of engagement. People can no longer reach you the way they used to. They can no longer move you the way they once did. And for the first time, the power in the room does not belong to the loudest voice. It belongs to the one who can wait. And in the stillness that follows, something else begins to form, not anger, not revenge, but a deeper question that will define what comes next. If silence already makes you this threatening, what happens when you stop caring whether they fear you at all? The moral lie they taught you a story early on. So early it didn't feel like a lesson, just the way the world worked. Be good and good things will come. Be patient and you will be rewarded. Be forgiving and you will be at peace. It sounded simple, clean, moral, and for a long time you lived by it without question. You learned to swallow irritation because patience was praised. You learned to overlook disrespect because forgiveness was holy. You learned to keep giving even when it hurt because generosity was virtue. And every time you hesitated, that old voice returned, calm and convincing, telling you this was what strong people did. This was what good people endured. What they didn't tell you was who benefits from this arrangement. No one warns you that morality, when simplified, becomes a leash. That words like kindness and humility can be reshaped into tools, not to elevate you, but to contain you. You were never taught to ask whether the system rewarding your goodness was fair, only whether your behavior was acceptable. And so you complied. You complied even when your boundaries were crossed because reacting felt wrong. You complied when your time was taken without permission because saying no felt selfish. You complied when your silence was mistaken for consent because correcting it felt confrontational. Each compromise felt small. Each sacrifice felt temporary. Together they built a cage. The moral lie was never that goodness is wrong. It was that goodness must be endless, unconditional, and quiet. That real virtue asks nothing in return. That strength is proven through endurance, not protection. And anyone who steps outside this narrative is suspect. This is where the villain label takes shape. Not when you hurt someone, not when you dominate, but when you stop absorbing damage politely. The first time you enforce a boundary without apology, the tone shifts. People don't ask what changed. They ask who you think you are. They invoke your past behavior as evidence against you, as if your previous compliance was a contract you signed for life. They remind you of your values, but only the ones that benefited them. This is not morality. It is conditioning. You begin to see how often moral language is used to shame strength. How be the bigger person usually means be the quieter one. How let it go often translates to accept what should never have happened. How forgiveness is demanded immediately, but accountability is postponed indefinitely. And something inside you resists, not loudly, not angrily, but firmly. You start questioning ideas you once accepted without hesitation. Why is patience only praised when it serves others? Why is selfishness condemned only when it looks like self-preservation? Why is assertiveness admired in some and punished in others? These questions don't make you bitter. They make you awake. Awareness is dangerous to systems built on obedience. You notice how quickly people reach for moral superiority when their access to you is threatened. How easily they frame themselves as victims the moment you stop accommodating them. The language is familiar now. You've heard it before, even used it on yourself. But it no longer lands the same, because you see the imbalance. Goodness, you realize, was never meant to mean vulnerability without limits. It was never meant to erase discernment. Yet somewhere along the way, you were taught that protecting yourself was a moral failure. That drawing lines was unkind. That choosing yourself was betrayal. This lie kept you manageable, and when you step out of it, the reaction is immediate. Confusion, resistance, judgment. You are no longer seen as principled. You are seen as changed, hardened, corrupted, as if morality was something you lost rather than something you refined. But you know the truth now. You didn't abandon goodness. You reclaimed it. You stripped it of the expectation that it must cost you everything. You separated compassion from compliance. You learned that morality without boundaries is not virtue. It is vulnerability exploited by those who refuse to be accountable. This realization doesn't make you cruel. It makes you selective. And selection is power. As this chapter unfolds, you feel the weight of an uncomfortable truth pressing closer. If the moral rules you lived by only applied to you, then they were never rules at all. They were restraints. And now that you see them clearly, the question is no longer whether you will break them. It is what happens when you do. The moment you stop apologizing for your strength, the world reacts as if you committed a sin. Not an obvious one, not something that can be named cleanly, but a quiet violation of expectation. You were supposed to carry more than your share without complaint. You were supposed to forgive faster than others reflected. You were supposed to remain accessible even when it cost you sleep, dignity, peace. By refusing, you disrupt a moral economy that depended on your self-denial. They begin to speak in familiar tones, disappointment disguised as concern, advice that sounds generous but carries an edge. They tell you you're becoming rigid, that life isn't meant to be so guarded, that you should be careful not to push people away. What they really mean is that you are no longer easy to reach, and that distance makes them uncomfortable. This is where guilt tries to re-enter. It asks whether you've gone too far, whether you've misunderstood kindness, whether you've mistaken self-protection for ego. These questions feel reasonable because they echo everything you were taught. But now, instead of reacting, you examine them. And in that examination, they fall apart. You look at the evidence of your own life, at how often your patience was taken as permission, how often your forgiveness prevented accountability, how often your silence allowed patterns to continue unchecked. You realize that morality, as it was practiced around you, rarely asked anything of those who caused harm. It asked everything of those willing to endure it. That is not balance. That is not justice. So you stop measuring your actions by how they make others feel in the moment. You start measuring them by whether they are aligned with truth, with fairness, with long-term integrity. This shift is subtle but seismic. It changes how you move through the world. You no longer rush to de-escalate at your own expense. You no longer feel responsible for restoring harmony when you didn't disrupt it. You let discomfort exist without rushing to anesthetize it with your compliance. And in doing so, you expose something many people rely on, your fear of being seen as bad. Once that fear dissolves, so does their leverage. They cannot shame you into silence anymore. They cannot invoke morality to override your boundaries. The old words still come, but they land on different ground now. You see the intention behind them. You hear what is being asked of you, and you decline calmly. This calm refusal is what earns you the label villain, not because you are unjust, but because you are no longer useful in the same way, because you refuse to absorb blame that isn't yours, because you don't collapse under moral pressure designed to keep you small. You have stepped outside the script, and there is no role prepared for you beyond antagonist. The irony is painful and precise. The moment you begin acting with true integrity, you are accused of losing it. But integrity, you realize, is not about being liked. It is about being aligned. It is about acting from principle even when it costs you approval. And that cost, once paid, frees you. You start to notice how much energy you once spent trying to appear virtuous instead of being honest. How often you chose politeness over clarity. How many conversations were shaped not by truth but by fear of fallout. Releasing that fear feels like shedding a heavy coat you didn't know you were wearing. You breathe differently now. Your decisions take longer, but they land firmer. You are not impulsive, but you are decisive. You are no longer swayed by emotional pressure or moral theatrics. You recognize when values are being invoked sincerely and when they are being used as tools of control. This discernment sharpens you. It makes you quieter, not because you have less to say, but because you no longer waste words where they will be twisted. You reserve your voice for moments that matter. And when you speak, it carries weight because it is no longer diluted by constant concession. As Chapter 3 deepens, another truth becomes unavoidable. Morality that demands your self-erasure is not morality at all. It is obedience wrapped in virtue language, and you were never meant to live that small. You feel the final shift of this chapter locking into place, steady and irreversible. You are no longer afraid of being the villain in someone else's story, because you finally understand whose story you are living. You begin to recognize how deeply that moral lie shaped your instincts, how quickly you once flinched at the thought of being seen as wrong, how reflexively you softened your edges before anyone even asked. You were trained to self-correct before others had to anticipate discomfort and erase it preemptively. This wasn't empathy, it was conditioning, and conditioning works best when it feels virtuous. You see it now in the way people react when you don't bend. The surprise comes first. Then the moral framing. They speak of values, of character, of who you used to be. They don't ask what led you here. They don't ask what changed inside you. They assume deviation must mean corruption. That growth must mean decay. It's easier that way. If you are wrong, they don't have to question the rules. If you are selfish, they don't have to examine their expectations. If you are the villain, they get to remain righteous. This realization is sobering, not because it makes you cynical, but because it makes you precise. You stop arguing with narratives designed to protect others from accountability. You realize that morality, when honest, is not fragile. It does not shatter under questioning. It does not require your silence to survive. True goodness does not ask you to betray yourself to prove it exists. Only systems of control do that. This understanding settles into your body like muscle memory. You no longer tense when someone disapproves. You no longer rush to justify your choices. Disapproval used to feel like danger. Now it feels like information, data, a signal of misalignment, not a verdict. And with that shift, fear loosens its grip. You notice how often people conflate discomfort with harm, how quickly they claim injury when confronted with boundaries, how easily they weaponize moral language to avoid sitting with consequences. Once you see this pattern, it becomes impossible to unsee. You stop confusing loud emotion with truth. You stop mistaking accusation for accuracy. You become harder to move, not rigid but grounded, anchored in something deeper than approval. Your values no longer live in other people's reactions. They live in your actions, consistent and measured. You don't announce them, you demonstrate them, and you don't explain them to those committed to misunderstanding you. This is where your posture changes completely. You stand differently in conversations. You listen without leaning forward. You speak without overqualifying. You allow silence after statements instead of rushing to fill it. These are small shifts, almost invisible, but they change the entire dynamic. You are no longer asking permission to exist as you are. Some people respect this immediately. Others resent it quietly. A few will never forgive you for it. That used to terrify you. Now it simply clarifies your landscape. You understand that being morally upright does not mean being universally palatable. That fairness does not require self-sacrifice without limit. That kindness loses its meaning when it is demanded instead of chosen. These truths don't harden you. They stabilize you. The villain narrative still circulates, of course. It always will. Anyone who steps outside expectation invites interpretation. But now that narrative no longer reaches inside you. It stays external where it belongs. You don't fight it. You don't feed it. You let it burn itself out on the reality of your consistency, and slowly something remarkable happens. The people who remain in your life begin to change how they treat you. They become clearer, more direct, more respectful. Not because you asked them to, but because ambiguity no longer works. Your presence demands honesty, not through force, but through refusal to play games. As Chapter 3 comes to a close, the final layer of the moral lie dissolves completely. You see now that goodness was never about being harmless. It was about being just. And justice, real justice, requires boundaries. It requires the courage to be misunderstood. It requires the willingness to be cast as the villain in stories that were never fair to begin with. You are no longer trying to be seen as good. You are committed to being true. And that commitment changes what comes next. Becoming unrecognizable transformation is rarely dramatic. It does not arrive with a flash of light or a sudden announcement. It begins in small, almost imperceptible shifts. A word withheld, a request denied, a boundary enforced. And in those small moments, you start to feel the contours of a person you barely recognize, even to yourself. The reflection in the mirror seems familiar, yet stranger, stronger, sharper, more deliberate. The person you once were, the one who absorbed everything, who spoke to smooth discomfort, who chased approval, starts to feel like a ghost. This new self is unrecognizable not because you have lost empathy, but because you have learned to conserve it. You give selectively, invest cautiously, and reveal only what is necessary. There is precision in your presence now, and that precision unsettles those around you. They are accustomed to access, to predictability, to the invisible labor you once performed. Now, without that constant offering, they must reckon with your autonomy, and autonomy is inherently intimidating. The loneliness comes quietly at first. You notice empty chairs at gatherings, pauses in conversations, messages left unsent. People once close now hesitate, unsure how to navigate someone who no longer responds predictably. Some distance themselves entirely, unable to tolerate a person who refuses to accommodate their comfort at every turn. There is grief in this, subtle and unrelenting. You mourn the ease of belonging, the simplicity of being liked without condition. But grief is not despair. It is recognition, and in that recognition, clarity grows. You see that much of your past life consisted of performing for the approval of others. Every softened response, every withheld reaction, every apology offered without cause was part of a pattern that kept you manageable. That pattern no longer exists. You begin to inhabit space differently. Your energy, your focus, your very rhythm of being aligns with your own principles rather than with external expectation. There is a cost. Becoming unrecognizable requires shedding parts of yourself that once felt essential. The innocence that allowed trust without suspicion. The patience that assumed fairness. The loyalty that expected reciprocity. These qualities were not flaws, they were strengths, but when exploited repeatedly, they became liabilities. And to survive, to thrive, to exist unbound, they must be tempered, redirected, controlled. With this shedding comes a sense of liberation so profound it almost terrifies. You realize that every compromise once made in the name of harmony was a tether. Every silence maintained to avoid conflict was a cage. And now, for the first time, you breathe without invisible restraint. Every decision carries weight because it is yours alone. Every action is intentional because it is no longer performed to suit the expectations of others. Yet transformation is never comfortable. The reflection you now inhabit is strong but isolated. You notice how your laughter reaches fewer people, how your words carry more gravity, how your presence demands consideration rather than being assumed. People who once leaned on your predictability now stumble. They test you. They try to provoke reactions you no longer give. They attempt to undermine the quiet authority you have cultivated. But you are steady, rooted in self-possession, impervious to manipulation. This is the paradox of becoming unrecognizable. The world feels colder, yet clarity shines brighter. You see motives with sharper focus. You feel energy more acutely. You discern intention and deceit without effort. And while some doors close, others open to spaces you never knew existed, people who respect boundaries, opportunities that demand courage, paths that align with your values rather than appease expectation. Discipline becomes your companion, precision your guide. You no longer act on impulse or seek immediate approval. Every choice is deliberate, every interaction measured, every word weighed. And in that deliberation, you find an unexpected power. You influence without coercion, command without threat, and exist without apology. There is fear too, but it is no longer debilitating. You fear only regression, only returning to the version of yourself who offered endlessly for validation. That fear sharpens rather than constrains. It reminds you that the transformation is irreversible. Once you've inhabited clarity, compromise that erodes your autonomy is no longer tolerable. And yet, transformation carries the weight of accountability. The old connections that depended on your previous self cannot be maintained. Friendships once effortless now require recalibration. Partnerships once balanced by your compromise must be renegotiated. You grieve not only the people who drift away, but the version of yourself that believed harmony was the ultimate virtue. That self, though loved and familiar, is gone. Still, what rises in its place is remarkable. You are steady. You are deliberate. You are no longer a passive participant in a world that rewards compliance and punishes honesty. Your strength is quiet, yet unmistakable. Your presence no longer negotiable. Your decisions no longer subject to the comfort of others. And as this chapter nears its end, one truth crystallizes: you cannot return, not fully, not without betraying everything you have learned. The past self who sought acceptance, avoided conflict, and softened constantly exists only as memory. The person you have become, calculated, self-possessed, unyielding, is permanent. You are unrecognizable, and that unrecognizability is your armor. It is the mark of someone who has chosen integrity over popularity, autonomy over convenience, and reality over comforting illusion. Yet with this power comes the quiet question that hangs in the air, heavier than ever. How will the world respond when you no longer seek their approval, when every action is intentional, and when every silence carries consequence? The unrecognizable self does not scream for attention. It does not boast, flaunt, or demand acknowledgement. It moves deliberately, observing the spaces it occupies and the energies it encounters. Every interaction becomes a choice rather than an obligation. You no longer perform for comfort, validation, or acceptance. You speak only when necessary, act only when aligned, and engage only when reciprocity, or at least respect, exists. The world notices, even if subtly. People feel the difference in your presence before they hear your words, and that awareness is disarming. Those who thrived on your predictability struggle. They realize that the dynamics they once controlled effortlessly no longer apply. The jokes they once made at your expense land differently or fail entirely. Requests that previously went unquestioned are met with hesitation, scrutiny, or outright denial. They feel exposed, off balance. And while some retreat quietly, others escalate, testing limits they once assumed were malleable. You do not flinch. Because you are unrecognizable not only to them, but to yourself. You have shed the reflexive tendencies that kept you small. You have erased the automatic responses that allowed others to manipulate your energy. And in that absence of reaction, you discover a surprising freedom. The freedom to act according to your own principles rather than someone else's expectations. This freedom carries weight. You notice it in subtle ways: how long you sit before replying, how deliberately you choose words, how much thought goes into whom you allow close to your inner world. Every decision, once automatic and performative, now requires consciousness. And that consciousness is both exhausting and exhilarating. You are no longer drifting, you are navigating with purpose, and that purpose commands respect. Some are intimidated by it. Your calm detachment, once a natural ease, now reads as impenetrable. They call you distant, cold, unapproachable. But they misunderstand. Distance is not detachment. Coldness is not absence of feeling. It is precision. You have chosen carefully what to invest in and where to place trust, and in doing so, you no longer allow the world to dictate your emotional labor. There is a loneliness in this clarity, yes, but it is tempered by self-possession. You walk through spaces once familiar, now strange, noticing which relationships were sustained by access and which by authenticity. You stop trying to bridge gaps where there was no reciprocity. You stop explaining yourself to those who will never truly understand. And in that refusal, you gain something many never experience: complete alignment between self and action. Even the air around you shifts. Conversations take on a different cadence. People wait for you to speak, not out of reverence, but out of recognition that what you say matters now. Their assumptions falter, their manipulations fail, and slowly, imperceptibly, they begin to treat you differently, not louder, not more aggressively, but with a respect that cannot be demanded, only earned through consistency and self-command. And here lies the quiet revelation of Chapter 4. Becoming unrecognizable is not transformation for others, it is reclamation for yourself. You are no longer negotiating your presence. You are no longer bending to avoid discomfort. You are no longer performing kindness to hide vulnerability. You exist in full measure, calibrated, deliberate, and intentionally free. The world will respond as it may, and that is no longer your concern. As this chapter closes, the truth settles like stone. The person you were willing to be for everyone else is gone. In its place is someone precise, grounded, unshakable, and yes, unrecognizable. The final question lingers. How will the world react when the unrecognizable self refuses to fit its expectations entirely? The world does not announce your transformation. It does not applaud, cheer, or signal acknowledgement. Change of this depth is silent at first, imperceptible even to those closest to you. But it is inexorable, and once it reaches full clarity, it is undeniable. You are no longer the person who apologized to keep peace, who softened edges to avoid discomfort, who vanished into the expectations of others. You are something else entirely. The ascent begins quietly, in small victories no one notices, a boundary enforced without apology, a request denied without guilt, a pause held when others expected explanation. These moments, seemingly minor, accumulate, layering strength upon strength. You realize that each act of self-possession is a reclamation of energy once surrendered, and with each reclamation, the world around you begins to shift in subtle, unspoken ways. People notice, of course. They may not understand, but they feel it. The first responses are usually confusion. Has something changed? They ask. Or more pointedly, why are you different? There is fear in the question, even if disguised. Fear because the familiar dynamic, the one where they could predict, influence, and manipulate, has been removed. And fear, more than anger, is the first indicator that your ascent is real. Some attempt to test you. A casual remark becomes a challenge. A friendly joke is designed to provoke. Requests are made indirectly, as if your resistance can be bypassed by subtlety. These tests are natural. The world instinctively probes boundaries it once moved through freely. But you are no longer accessible in the ways they expect. You do not flinch, react, or rationalize. You exist in your own tempo. You hold the line, unwavering, and in doing so, you assert a power that is as quiet as it is absolute. The villain, you now understand, is not someone who destroys. The villain is someone who cannot be moved in the way the world desires. Someone whose equilibrium is self-sufficient. Someone whose presence alone demands recalibration from those around them. By refusing to negotiate your energy, by refusing to be molded, you have become untouchable. This untouchability is both a shield and a weapon. It is a shield because no manipulation, no guilt, no expectation can pierce it. It is a weapon because its existence forces others to confront their own methods of control, exposing the fragility of their assumptions. You do not need to act aggressively. Your calm, deliberate presence is more threatening than any outburst. The world scrambles to understand, to categorize, to reclaim what cannot be claimed. And in that scramble, you rise. As you ascend, clarity becomes your ally. You see the patterns in behavior that were invisible before. You understand who thrives on your compliance, who respects it, who resents it. You learn to invest where it matters and withdraw where it does not. You speak with precision, act with intention, and move without unnecessary exposure. Every choice is a statement, every silence a declaration. You are no longer defined by the perceptions of others, but by the alignment of your own principles. There is exhilaration in this power, but it is tempered by awareness. You know the stakes. The world will resist. People will attempt to provoke, misinterpret, and challenge you. That is inevitable, but fear no longer binds you. You have learned that being misunderstood is preferable to being compromised. You have learned that discomfort, when born of truth, is a signal of integrity, not weakness. You have learned that the villain is often misunderstood not because they are wrong, but because the world preferred them pliable. This ascent is not sudden. It is layered, cumulative, inevitable. Each lesson learned, each boundary enforced, each refusal to yield compounds, and the person who emerges is not recognizable to those who once knew you. You are sharper, steadier, and unassailable. You do not seek revenge, yet the world feels the weight of your presence. You do not need to dominate, yet influence flows naturally toward you because you occupy space that was previously given away. The final truth of this transformation is profound and unsettling. The villain is not born from malice, rage, or hatred. The villain ascends from self-possession, clarity, and the refusal to be exploited. The villain is a force the world cannot ignore, not because they harm, but because they refuse to be harmed. Their power is the consequence of autonomy, and autonomy is the most threatening presence of all. And as the chapter and the story draws to a close, you recognize the full scope of what has happened. You have become untouchable, not through domination, but through alignment. You are feared not because you seek it, but because the world has learned that you cannot be contained. You are the embodiment of consequence without aggression, clarity without compromise, and strength without apology. The world will never fully understand you. Some will vilify you. Some will admire you in secret. Some will desperately attempt to reclaim the version of you that no longer exists. And you will simply exist, fully realized, untouchable, undeniable. Because the villain does not seek approval. The villain does not negotiate their existence. The villain ascends not by force, but by the inevitable truth of self-possession. And now, standing at the summit of this transformation, one final certainty emerges. You were always going to be hated anyway. So you chose to be the villain. You're going to be hated anyway, so be the villain hook. They told you to be good, to forgive, to endure, to smile while they used you, and you believed them. But goodness has a price, and you were paying it in silence. What if everything you were taught about being good was a lie? What if the world was never fair and kindness was never protection? Imagine the moment you stop caring whether they like you, and in that stillness become something unstoppable. If you feel this, like, share, and subscribe, because this story will change the way you move through the world. The birth of the villain, when silence becomes a threat, the moral lie they taught you becoming unrecognizable. The villain ascends the weight of your absence the first time you notice it. It is almost imperceptible. A pause left unanswered, a message read but unreplied, a room entered without the usual soft apology for taking up space. At first, it feels awkward, even wrong. You are used to being present, used to filling the silence, used to easing tension with explanations, reassurances, and words that soothe more than they reveal. But now, for the first time, you do not respond, not immediately, not predictably, not at all. And in that space, the world shifts. They notice before they admit it. A glance lingers longer, a question falters, a conversation stalls. The people who took for granted your constant availability suddenly feel the absence they never respected. They do not understand it. They cannot name it. And that is precisely the point. Silence, you begin to realize, is heavier than any explanation you ever offered, sharper than any argument you once made. It is a presence felt, a force that does not speak, yet communicates everything. For years, you were conditioned to apologize for existing too fully, for taking up too much space, for expecting respect as naturally as you breathe. You were trained to smooth discomfort, to soften edges, to make everyone else comfortable while you shrank quietly. Your kindness was taken as granted, your patience exploited, your voice dismissed. Each compromise, each concession, each unacknowledged effort accumulated, quietly eroding the strength that had always been inside you. And then one day you pause, you step back. You remove yourself, not in anger, not in revenge, but simply in recognition that your presence is not owed endlessly to those who take it for granted. The first moments are filled with a strange relief, a quiet liberation. You notice the emptiness of the space you leave, the subtle imbalance it creates. It is astonishing, almost shocking, how much your absence can shift the energy around you. They look for you. They speak over the silence, filling the gap with assumptions, questions, justifications, and attempts to elicit a reaction. But you do not respond, not yet. You observe, you let them fumble, struggle, and twist in the subtle pressure of your stillness. And in that observation, a truth crystallizes. You have always been more powerful than they imagined simply by existing on your own terms. It is not dramatic. There is no explosive confrontation, no thunderous announcement. It is quiet, almost imperceptible, yet it resonates. The weight of your absence is unmistakable. People who once moved freely within the contours of your compliance now find the space empty, undefined, unsettling. Every expectation they had of your predictability collapses under the simple fact that you are no longer performing for them. You feel a mixture of fear and exhilaration. Fear because the world resists what it cannot control. Fear because you sense the tension in their eyes, the subtle shifts in tone, the questions that hang unsaid. And exhilaration because you understand the unspoken truth. They are aware of your absence in ways they cannot articulate, in ways they cannot reconcile, and it terrifies them. In these moments, you see the patterns more clearly. Every slight, every manipulation, every expectation that went unchallenged in the past becomes visible in stark relief. You recognize how easily your patience was weaponized, your forgiveness exploited, your silence misread as consent. The world depended on your compliance, and in stepping back, you expose the fragility of that dependence. There is a strange joy in this realization, not the joy of malice, not the satisfaction of vengeance, but the quiet triumph of awareness. You see the truth of your own value, and it does not need to be acknowledged. You do not need applause, reassurance, or permission. The mere fact of your presence or absence is enough. The imbalance you create is the confirmation of your power. You notice the smallest details, a hesitation in speech, a repeated glance toward where you once were, the subtle shift in energy when they realize you are no longer immediately accessible. It is a slow, almost imperceptible unraveling, but it is happening nonetheless. And it teaches you something vital. Silence is not emptiness. Silence is leverage. Silence carries weight, presence, and consequence in ways words never could. Over time, this becomes a practice, a rhythm. You learn when to step back, when to withhold, when to observe rather than react. You see how much the world relies on the noise you once provided, the explanations you once gave, the constant adjustments you once made. And each instance reinforces the quiet truth. Your absence is more destructive than any argument, any confrontation, any verbal assault could ever be. You feel the first twinges of fear again, but now tempered with understanding. They will attempt to fill the silence, to provoke, to regain the control they have lost. They will frame your stillness as coldness, detachment, or hostility. But you know better. You know that this silence is not weakness. It is self-possession. It is clarity. It is the manifestation of a power the world has never accounted for. By the end of these initial moments, a subtle transformation begins within you. You no longer fear being absent. You no longer measure your value by the reactions you provoke. You begin to understand that influence does not require words. Presence alone, carefully measured, can move the world in ways confrontation never could. And with this understanding comes a sense of freedom that is at once terrifying and exhilarating. The weight of your absence is no longer something to feel guilty about. It is intentional. It is deliberate. It is the first step in a transformation that will ripple outward, touching everyone who once underestimated, exploited, or ignored you. And as the chapter draws to a close, one quiet, undeniable truth settles in. They feel your absence far more profoundly than any words you ever spoke. Silence, you realize, is not passive. It is power. The weight of your absence. The longer you maintain this quiet, the more it becomes a mirror. People begin to project onto it, to fill the void with their own insecurities and fears. They speak louder, move faster, scramble to reclaim what they had always assumed was theirs. Your attention, your explanation, your emotional labor. And in their scramble, you see clearly how much they relied on your predictability. How much power you unknowingly surrendered simply by being present, by caring too much, by responding too readily. It is in these moments that you understand the paradox. Absence does not diminish you. It enlarges the space around you. It forces recognition without declaration. You do not need to assert dominance. You do not need to justify, argue, or explain. The world perceives the shift because it has no other choice, and perception, once awakened, cannot be easily ignored. There is a strange beauty in watching this unraveling. Not cruelty, not revenge, but clarity. The very patterns of dependence and expectation that once trapped you are now laid bare. You notice who struggles to fill the space with meaningless noise and who steps forward with substance, with genuine intention. The distinction is stark, illuminating, almost painful in its honesty, and yet it is intoxicating. For the first time, you feel the weight of your own presence without dilution. You feel what it is to occupy space deliberately, to invest energy selectively, to respond only when it matters. Every moment of restraint, every unspoken word, every withheld explanation compounds into something heavier than words could ever carry. The absence you once feared becomes a force you command. They notice, of course. There is a subtle shift in their energy when you enter a room, when you choose not to explain yourself, when you withhold the responses they expect. Their glances linger, their smiles falter, their questions come coated with hesitation. They sense a boundary without your pointing it out. They feel the distance you maintain, and they do not know how to navigate it. And that is when the quiet power truly begins to settle inside you. No one taught you that stillness could feel like authority. No one showed you that withholding reaction could dismantle expectations, recalibrate relationships, and expose truths. You discover it through observation, patience, and the slow accumulation of moments where you resist the urge to justify, to appease, to soften. Each small decision builds on the last. Each pause, each non-response, each silent observation reinforces the truth. Presence and absence are two sides of the same coin. And your absence is worth far more than the words you once gave so freely. You start noticing subtler effects. Conversations become more deliberate around you. People measure their words, their tone, their requests. They hesitate where they once assumed compliance. Their attempts to provoke, to manipulate, to assert dominance falter in the weight of your stillness. And with every faltering attempt, your understanding deepens. Silence is a language they have never learned to read. And because it is foreign, it terrifies them. There is a strange tension in the air, palpable and unspoken, a quiet pressure that did not exist when you reacted, explained, or justified. And you realize the truth. All the times you thought being quiet was weakness, all the times you assumed absence was vulnerability, you had been wrong. Silence is not passive, it is potent, it is strategic. It is far more powerful than reaction because it allows the world to reveal itself on its own terms without interference. And in that realization, something shifts in you. You feel a subtle, almost imperceptible change in posture, in rhythm, in energy. You are no longer bracing for expectation, no longer rushing to meet demands. You inhabit yourself fully, deliberately. Every thought, every glance, every measured interaction becomes a testament to your autonomy. You feel unshakable not because others cannot harm you, but because you no longer surrender your presence at their whim. The first part of Chapter 1 closes with this quiet, unsettling understanding. You have discovered a power that has always existed inside you, one the world never allowed you to wield. Your absence is no longer something to be feared, regretted, or justified. It is intentional, it is deliberate, and it is devastatingly effective. The weight of your absence has begun to rewrite the rules. The weight of your absence. The more you embrace this stillness, the more the world begins to reveal its true structure. You notice the delicate webs of expectation that once surrounded you, the invisible threads connecting every favor, every concession, every compromise you made. And now, by stepping back, by refusing to react automatically, you see how easily those threads unravel. The people who relied on your compliance scramble to rebuild what they assumed was permanent, but nothing in their world is permanent when your presence is measured, selective, intentional. It is a subtle form of power, one that is invisible yet undeniable. You do not need to raise your voice or assert authority. You do not need to confront, argue, or justify. Your absence speaks louder than any speech ever could. The hesitation in their movements, the faltering in their words, the almost imperceptible tension in the room, all of it is proof that silence carries influence. And the realization hits like a cold wind. They have always underestimated you. They have always relied on your energy, and now that energy is yours to command. There is a weight to this power. It is not easy, nor is it comfortable. To remain silent when provoked, to withhold explanation when demanded, to let them squirm under the pressure of your stillness. It requires patience, self-control, and a deep understanding of your own value. Every instinct that once urged you to justify yourself, to appease, to explain, must be resisted. And in resisting, you discover a strength that was always inside you, hidden beneath years of accommodation and compromise. This strength is not loud. It is not aggressive. It is deliberate, precise, and unassailable. And because it is quiet, it is terrifying to those who have grown accustomed to control. They are used to reading you, predicting your moves, manipulating your reactions. And now, for the first time, you are unreadable, unpredictable, untouchable. They sense it instinctively, though they cannot articulate it. And in that sense, your silence becomes a weapon more effective than any words you could utter. You notice the small, almost imperceptible changes in behavior around you. People who once demanded your attention hesitate before speaking. Requests come with hesitation, as if testing the boundaries you have set without announcing them. Glances linger, questions falter, and you watch it all unfold with a quiet awareness that thrills and terrifies simultaneously. For the first time, you understand the true value of your presence and absence, and the unspoken authority it conveys. And yet there is a tension that accompanies this power. Some recoil, offended by your refusal to bend to their expectations. Some try to provoke, to force you into the old patterns. And some quietly observe, recalibrating how they interact with you, unsure how to navigate a person who no longer conforms. But you do not flinch. You remain still. You observe. You wait. And in that waiting, you allow the world to reveal itself, exposing motives, insecurities, and truths that would have remained hidden had you continued to react, explain, and appease. There is a strange kind of justice in this. Not revenge, not malice, not cruelty, but balance. For years, you carried the burden of accommodating others, of smoothing discomfort, of sacrificing yourself for the comfort of those who would never do the same. And now, by doing nothing, by speaking less, by simply existing on your own terms, you tip the scales. The world begins to pay attention, not to what you say, but to what you withhold. Not to the explanations you offer, but to the silence you maintain. This is a revelation that hits deeper than any confrontation could. You realize that the world does not need your noise. It does not require your explanations. It does not deserve your energy. And once this truth settles inside you, everything changes. The old patterns, the endless giving, the constant appeasing, the relentless attempts to maintain peace at your own expense, begin to dissolve. You start to see clearly what is yours, what is not, and what you are no longer willing to surrender. By the end of this part, a quiet transformation has taken place. You are no longer merely present in the world. You are intentional. Your silence is calculated, precise, and immensely powerful. Every pause, every withheld response, every step back compounds into a force that cannot be ignored. You are no longer reacting to the world. The world is now reacting to you. And as this part of the chapter closes, one undeniable truth emerges. Their discomfort is the proof of your power. Their confusion is the evidence of your strength. And your silence, calm, deliberate, unbroken, is the weapon they never saw coming, the weight of your absence. The culmination of this quiet awakening is both subtle and seismic. You notice how deeply your absence resonates, not just in the physical spaces you leave behind, but in the emotional landscapes of those who once relied on your energy. Every glance, every hesitation, every faltering question is amplified by the knowledge that you are no longer predictable, no longer accessible on demand. You are no longer the person who would sacrifice yourself for their comfort. You are no longer the one who would explain, apologize, or soften yourself to make them feel at ease. And in that realization, a strange sense of liberation takes hold. You begin to understand that your presence, your attention, your voice are not entitlements to be given freely. They are forces of consequence, tools of influence, and weapons more precise than anger, argument, or confrontation ever could be. The world once assumed you would give endlessly. The world once assumed that compliance was your nature. But that assumption is shattered now, and the fracture is visible in every interaction, every glance, every unspoken word. You feel the weight of this truth settle inside you, a weight that is neither heavy nor burdensome but grounding. You are no longer dangling on the threads of expectation. You no longer bend to the invisible will of others. You occupy space fully, deliberately, with measured intention. And in this presence, quiet, still, unyielding, you discover something transformative, the power to shape reality not through noise but through the deliberate withholding of it. There is a tension that comes with this power, some attempt to provoke, to fill the silence with chaos, to demand responses, explanations, or justifications. They may test boundaries, push limits, and provoke discomfort. But you do not respond impulsively. You do not give them the satisfaction of reaction. You do not speak unless it serves your purpose, act unless it aligns with your principle, or move unless it strengthens your position. You observe, you measure, and you remain unshakable. The most striking realization comes gradually. The world does not know how to deal with someone who refuses to react according to expectation. They rely on your compliance, your predictability, your willingness to make concessions, and when those are withdrawn, they become unbalanced. You feel their unease as clearly as you feel the weight of your own stillness. You sense the anxiety, the frustration, the unspoken calculations behind every hesitant glance and faltering word. And you understand with a calm certainty that the imbalance you create is your leverage. This is not cruelty. This is not malice. This is not even dominance in the traditional sense. It is the recognition that presence and absence carry immense power. That restraint can be more devastating than fury, and that silence is a force the world has never respected because it has never feared it. And now you fear it not because it controls you, but because you control it. As this first chapter closes, the full weight of your transformation begins to settle. You no longer apologize for existing fully. You no longer sacrifice yourself for the comfort of others. You no longer allow your energy to be consumed without acknowledgement, without reciprocity, without respect. The world feels the shift. They notice the absence. They sense the weight, and they do not know how to navigate it. The final undeniable truth emerges. Silence is not weakness. Silence is not avoidance. Silence is not emptiness. Silence is power, absolute, precise, and undeniable. And in this power lies the first step of your transformation. A transformation that will unfold in ways the world cannot anticipate, cannot control, and cannot stop. The weight of your absence has begun, and it is only the beginning. The unseen weapon silence is not emptiness. Silence is an instrument, a weapon forged not in anger but in the measured restraint of self-possession. You discover slowly that the world relies on your reactions more than your words, more than your presence, more than your explanations. Every glance, every word, every gesture is anticipated, manipulated, and weighed against the backdrop of your compliance. And when that compliance is removed, when the familiar rhythm of reaction is replaced by deliberate stillness, The equilibrium that others depended upon fractures. The first encounters with this realization are subtle. A conversation stalls. Someone asks a question, expecting a flurry of response, a validation of their assumptions, a concession to their demands. But you do not respond in the way they expect. You pause, you measure, you wait. And in that pause, the tension is palpable, almost suffocating. They do not yet understand what they are facing. They only feel it. The silence presses, disorients, unsettles. And the more they struggle to regain control, the more the power of your restraint becomes apparent. You notice the patterns forming. People fidget under the pressure of your unspoken authority. Their smiles falter. Their casual dominance fails. They search for reactions you no longer offer. Every manipulation, every subtle attempt to provoke, every expectation of immediate compliance falters. They begin to reveal truths about themselves, insecurities, desperation, dependency, without realizing it. And you, standing still, calm, unreactive, witness it all with a clarity that would have been impossible in the old version of yourself. This is the first lesson of the unseen weapon. Influence does not require engagement. Presence alone, measured and deliberate, is enough to force acknowledgement. You do not need to argue. You do not need to justify. You do not need to raise your voice. The weight of your calm, the precision of your stillness, the unwavering nature of your boundaries communicates volumes the world is incapable of ignoring. It is intoxicating to realize, even in part, that people are unbalanced not by your words, but by your silence. That what they relied on most, the predictability of your reactions, the immediacy of your responses, the ease with which they could manipulate your energy, no longer exists. They have to confront the unexpected, the unfamiliar, a presence that does not bend, that does not yield, that does not justify. And in that confrontation, they feel the weight of their own miscalculations, the fragility of the power they once held over you. Some attempt to test the boundaries. Casual provocations, indirect digs, half-questions laden with expectation. They arrive as natural instincts to reclaim dominance. But you do not flinch. You do not stumble. You do not reveal frustration, irritation, or weakness. You have learned that the weapon is not aggression, it is control. Control over your own presence, your own reactions, your own energy. And the world, unused to such equilibrium, recoils in ways subtle yet unmistakable. The tension is not immediate. It builds, accumulates, and finally it manifests in the smallest of moments. A hesitation before a question, a glance that lingers too long, a misstep in conversation. They sense that you are no longer the person who exists to accommodate, to explain, to soften. And that realization is disarming. For the first time, they feel uncertainty in spaces they had always assumed were predictable. And uncertainty is frightening. You watch it happen almost invisibly. People reveal their weaknesses without knowing they do. Dependence, arrogance, control, fear, they all leak out in the face of your restraint. And you understand the subtle, terrifying truth. By saying nothing, doing nothing, reacting to nothing, you are more powerful than you ever imagined. Words, arguments, confrontation, these are tools of the reactive. Silence is the weapon of the untouchable, yet the weapon carries responsibility. To wield silence effectively requires discipline, awareness, and patience. It is not a performance of coldness, nor a strategy of cruelty. It is an alignment with principle, a calibration of energy, and an understanding that the most profound influence is often invisible. Those who misuse this realization mistake it for arrogance or malice, but the truth is deeper. You do not act from impulse. You act from awareness. You do not respond for effect. You withhold for consequence. And as you wield this weapon, you feel a subtle shift in your own being. Confidence emerges not from domination, but from self-possession. Awareness sharpens, clarity deepens, and patience becomes a force of its own. You move through the world with a rhythm previously unknown. You notice the micro-tensions, the small cracks in demeanor, the faltering assumptions. Each observation reinforces a simple, brutal truth. Silence, when wielded deliberately, dismantles far more than words ever could. By the end of this part, one undeniable fact is clear. They have underestimated. They have relied on your predictability, assumed your compliance, and taken your energy for granted. And now, the quiet reality strikes them with terrifying precision. Your silence is the weapon they never prepared for. As you continue to wield this silence, the effect becomes more profound, more deliberate. You begin to see how deeply people are conditioned to expect noise, reaction, and explanation. They are trained to respond to volume, to urgency, to agitation, but they are ill-prepared for the absence of those things. And in that absence, they flounder. They overthink, second-guess, question motives, and scramble for a foothold that no longer exists. Every attempt to control or manipulate falls flat. Every expectation of immediate response is met with nothing. And in that void, they reveal themselves. It is in these moments that silence becomes more than absence. It becomes a mirror. People show you who they truly are when you do not react. Their masks slip, their intentions bare themselves, and the truth of their dependency becomes undeniable. You do not need to ask, to accuse, or to interrogate. You do not need to expose them. They expose themselves simply by attempting to fill the gap your silence has created. And that, perhaps more than anything, is the beauty of the unseen weapon. It does not fight, it reveals. It does not confront, it clarifies. And it does so without aggression, without spectacle, without noise. Some are uncomfortable with this new dynamic. They search for ways to provoke you into the old rhythm, to reclaim the control they believed they had. They test boundaries, poke at nerves, and push with subtle, insidious persistence. But you do not yield. You do not rise to their bait. You remain deliberate, measured, and precise. And with each failed attempt, your authority grows, invisible yet undeniable. They learn, whether consciously or unconsciously, that their expectations no longer dictate your behavior. You feel it in the room before you hear it. The subtle shift of energy as someone realizes their usual tactics no longer apply. The hesitation in speech, the carefully weighed words, the pauses where once there were none. The world bends not to your anger or your persuasion, but to your presence, or more accurately, the absence of reaction within your presence. This is the unseen weapon, a force that moves the world without raising a hand, without speaking a single word, without leaving a trace of malice. Yet wielding such a weapon requires patience. It is not instantaneous. It is not about immediate gratification or proving a point. It is about constancy. It is about restraint. It is about understanding that influence, when exercised without reaction, accumulates quietly and inexorably. The impact may not be visible in the moment, but over time, it alters dynamics, recalibrates assumptions, and exposes truths that were once hidden beneath noise and distraction. You notice the subtle changes in behavior. People begin to approach you differently, hesitating where they once commanded. They weigh their words, adjust their tone, and second-guess their intentions. They may attempt to reclaim influence, but the tools they relied on, provocation, expectation, assumption, no longer hold sway. And in this recalibration, the unseen weapon reveals its full potency. You do not need to dominate. You only need to remain unshakable, deliberate, and invisible in your force. This realization is almost intoxicating. Not in arrogance, not in pride, not in cruelty, but in clarity. The world assumes that noise equals power, that reaction equals authority, that presence must be loud to be recognized. And in that assumption lies their weakness. Your silence, precise and deliberate, exposes the fragility of their conditioning. They feel threatened not because you are aggressive or confrontational, but because you are not manipulable. You are not predictable. You are untouchable. And as this part of the chapter draws to a close, one truth becomes unmistakable. Silence is not passive. It is strategic. It is deliberate. It is force manifested without motion. Words, arguments, confrontation, these are tools for those who cannot command the unseen. You have discovered the weapon they never anticipated. And in that discovery, a subtle, terrifying shift has occurred. The balance of power has moved quietly, irrevocably to you. The deeper you immerse yourself in this stillness, the more the world begins to reveal the fragility of its assumptions. People assume compliance, predictability, and availability because that is what they have always known. And now, with each deliberate pause, with each measured absence, they confront the unexpected. A presence that is neither pliable nor reactive, a force that cannot be coerced, compelled, or hurried. Their unease grows, subtly at first, then unmistakably. You see it in the hesitation of their steps, the tremor in their tone, the careful way they choose each word. The more they attempt to regain control, the more they demonstrate the potency of the restraint you wield. This is the essence of the unseen weapon, influence through non-action. It is the ability to command attention without speaking, to elicit recognition without demand, to expose truth without accusation. The moments of silence, the deliberate absence of reaction, create tension, unease, and reflection. They force others to confront their own intentions, to wrestle with their own dependency on your energy, and to recalibrate the power dynamic they have always assumed was fixed. You notice that the most aggressive, the most domineering, the most manipulative individuals are the ones most unsettled by your stillness. Their usual tactics, provocation, intimidation, subtle coercion, fail in the presence of quiet authority. You do not escalate. You do not yield. You observe. And in that observation, you recognize patterns that were invisible when you were reactive, when your energy was consumed by defending, justifying, or appeasing. You see clearly how others project their insecurities, their ambitions, their fears onto the energy you once provided, and how desperately they relied on your predictability. There is an almost surgical precision to this power. You do not act for effect. You do not seek recognition or retaliation. Each pause, each withheld word, each measured interaction is calculated, deliberate, and intentional. The world reacts not because you demand it, but because it cannot help but respond to a force that cannot be read, anticipated, or manipulated. And in that response, the unseen weapon reveals itself fully. Your silence dismantles illusions, shifts power, and forces accountability in ways words never could. You begin to understand the subtle, terrifying truth. Influence does not require speech. Presence alone, measured, intentional, and unshakable, is enough to move the world. Every hesitation you elicit, every faltering glance, every moment of discomfort is a testament to the power of restraint. The quiet, deliberate absence of reaction becomes a mirror in which others see themselves, their intentions, and the fragility of the control they once assumed. Yet this power is not without responsibility. To wield the unseen weapon effectively, you must resist impulse, anger, and the temptation to assert dominance through reaction. Every instinct to explain, defend, or justify must be tempered by awareness. Every desire to respond immediately must be held in check. Silence is not passive, it is deliberate. It is force exercised with patience, precision, and self-possession. And the more consistently you maintain it, the more undeniable its potency becomes. You feel a shift within yourself as well. Confidence grows not from aggression or confrontation, but from clarity, observation, and restraint. Awareness deepens. Patience becomes a tool, a force multiplier. You learn to navigate the world with a rhythm previously unknown, noticing micro-tensions, identifying vulnerabilities, and understanding the subtle dance of human expectation and reliance. And in mastering this rhythm, you realize that silence is not a void. It is a weapon far more precise than anger, argument, or coercion. By the end of this part, the weight of your understanding is undeniable. They have relied on your energy, your compliance, your predictability, and it is gone. They do not know how to respond. They do not know how to regain control. And in that space of uncertainty, the unseen weapon exerts its full force. You have learned that restraint, presence, and deliberate stillness can shift the balance of power more effectively than any confrontation ever could. The culmination of wielding the unseen weapon is quiet, yet devastatingly effective. You realize that influence is no longer measured by how loudly you assert yourself, but by how deeply your absence and restraint echo through the world around you. Every expectation that others had of your compliance begins to crumble. They search for the familiar patterns, the habitual responses, the predictable behaviors they relied upon, and they find nothing. They are unbalanced, uncertain, exposed. And you, calm and deliberate, watch as the world struggles to adapt to a force it cannot read or control. It is in this tension that the unseen weapon reaches its apex. Those who once manipulated you, demanded from you, or tested your limits now encounter the full weight of your self-possession. They flinch at your quiet authority, stumble in conversations they once dominated, and hesitate in spaces they assumed were under their control. And yet, you do nothing overt. You do not speak to teach them a lesson. You do not act to assert dominance. You merely exist, deliberate in your choices, measured in your presence, untouchable in your calm. You begin to see patterns that were invisible when you were reactive. You see who is genuinely aligned with integrity, who is opportunistic, and who relies solely on manipulation to maintain influence. The silence exposes motives, unveils weaknesses, and forces accountability without a single word spoken. It is surgical, precise, and unrelenting in its subtlety. The world reacts not to noise, argument, or confrontation, but to the quiet, deliberate force of self-command. Some will resist, of course. They will attempt to provoke you, to bait you into reaction, to reclaim control through subtle coercion or indirect aggression. But by now, you understand the rhythm of the unseen weapon. To yield is to weaken it, to react impulsively is to diminish it. Restraint, observation, and deliberate stillness are its core, and the more consistently you practice it, the more undeniable its effect becomes. People who cannot manipulate your energy begin to recognize the limits of their influence, and that recognition is profoundly unsettling for them. You also notice the internal transformation that accompanies this mastery. Confidence does not come from dominance, confrontation, or spectacle. It comes from self-possession, clarity, and awareness. You move through the world with precision, navigating human energy, reading micro-tensions, and understanding the subtle interplay of expectation and dependence. Patience becomes a weapon, observation a shield, and silence a sword. You no longer bend to pressure. You create it by simply being. And the most powerful realization emerges. Your absence, your restraint, your deliberate silence is more destructive than any confrontation could ever be. It dismantles illusions, exposes truths, and forces accountability without a single raised voice. Those who once underestimated you now feel the weight of your calm, and that weight is heavier than anger, louder than argument, and sharper than any attempt at manipulation. As this chapter closes, one truth crystallizes with absolute clarity. The unseen weapon is the mastery of presence and absence, the deliberate orchestration of energy and restraint, the quiet, unshakable power of self-possession. And those who once assumed control over you are now forced to confront a force they cannot touch, cannot read, and cannot overcome. Silence is not passivity. Silence is not weakness. Silence is strategy. Silence is power. Breaking the chains of expectation, the world has always assumed it owns you, not in a literal sense, but in a subtle, unspoken way. From childhood, through education, through relationships, society teaches you to conform, to accommodate, to bend so that others can move freely around you. Your patience, your kindness, your willingness to forgive, these are not celebrated, they are exploited. And for years you comply, believing that to do otherwise would be selfish, rude, or destructive. But slowly, painfully, you realize that the chains of expectation are not suggestions, they are traps. Every apology you offered to smooth discomfort, every concession you made to prevent conflict, every smile that masked frustration built invisible walls around your autonomy. You gave your energy as a currency, expecting peace, validation, or reciprocity, and received none in return. Boundaries were dismissed, efforts ignored, and your kindness weaponized against you. Each small compromise accumulated, layering exhaustion upon vulnerability, eroding your sense of self. And in that erosion, you begin to see the truth. The rules were never fair, and the world never intended for you to exist fully, unreservedly, on your own terms. The first step in breaking these chains is recognition. You see clearly the patterns that once seemed normal, the constant need to appease, the endless explanations, the habit of excusing others' behavior while judging your own. You notice how people tested limits, how they manipulated patience, and how your compliance allowed them to operate unchallenged. And then a quiet fury, tempered with clarity, begins to rise. Not the impulsive, chaotic anger of reaction, but a focused, precise determination that you will no longer surrender yourself to their expectations. This is where the transformation begins. You start refusing the scripts handed to you by society, family, colleagues, and acquaintances. You no longer answer every question, soften every critique, or accommodate every demand. Your boundaries become imperatives, not suggestions. You recognize that self-sacrifice without acknowledgement is not virtue, it is exploitation. And in the deliberate withdrawal from these old patterns, you begin to reclaim a power long denied. The effect is subtle, then unmistakable. People notice the shift before they understand it. They pause before speaking, measure their tone, hesitate in their requests. Some react with confusion, others with frustration, and a few with outright hostility. But the true revelation is internal. You feel the freedom of autonomy, the clarity of self-possession, and the quiet satisfaction of alignment with your own principles. The chains of expectation, once invisible, are broken piece by piece, and you discover a strength that had always been within you, waiting for recognition. It is not a single act that severs these chains. It is a cumulative process, a series of deliberate choices that assert your value and sovereignty. Each refusal to overextend, each pause before compliance, each measured step away from obligation reinforces a principle that cannot be challenged. Your energy, your presence, your life is yours, not theirs. The world may resist, may test, may attempt to reclaim what it assumed was forever under its control, but you have discovered a truth more powerful than expectation. Autonomy cannot be stolen once it is recognized. And as you practice this, you see how deeply the chains were embedded. Expectations are not just social, they are psychological. People assume compliance, predictability, and availability because it has always worked. But when you refuse to conform, when you step back from ingrained patterns, you expose their reliance on your submission. They stumble in their attempts to manipulate, provoke, or control. The imbalance is palpable, a subtle yet unmistakable tension that grows with every refusal to yield. It is in these moments that self-possession becomes revolutionary. You realize that most of the suffering, frustration, and exhaustion you experienced were not caused by external circumstances, but by your compliance with unspoken rules that never served you. Breaking these chains is not rebellion, it is restoration. It is the reclamation of energy, clarity, and purpose. And as you reclaim each piece of yourself, the world around you trembles, not because you have become aggressive, but because you have become untethered, deliberate, and undeniably independent. The liberation is intoxicating, yet deliberate. It is not about chaos or disruption, but about recalibration. You do not seek revenge. You do not seek to dominate. You seek alignment with your own principles, respect for your own boundaries, and acknowledgement of your intrinsic value. And in that pursuit, every reaction from the world becomes a reflection of its dependence on your previous compliance. The chains of expectation are exposed, fragile and easily dismantled when met with deliberate stillness, autonomy, and quiet refusal. By the end of this first part, one truth is undeniable. The world assumed it could dictate your presence, your energy, your boundaries, and it was wrong. Every small act of self-possession, every refusal to comply unconsciously, every measured pause in response, fractures the assumptions that held you captive. The liberation is not loud, not dramatic, not theatrical. It is precise, deliberate, and unassailable. The chains are breaking. As the chains begin to shatter, you start to notice the subtle, almost imperceptible shifts in the behavior of those around you. People who once assumed your compliance now hesitate. They weigh their words before speaking, adjust their tone, and second-guess their expectations. Every glance, every question, every unspoken demand becomes filtered through the realization that you are no longer automatically available. And in this hesitation, you glimpse the power that comes from refusing to be bound by their assumptions. The world is trained to take the willing, the accommodating, the obedient. And when you refuse to participate in that system, when you step outside the script that was written for you without your consent, it reacts with discomfort. They attempt to provoke, to test, to reclaim what they assumed was theirs. But now your presence is deliberate, your reactions measured, and your energy safeguarded. You do not bend to expectation. You do not apologize for existing fully. You do not give them the satisfaction of control. And in that refusal, you discover a terrifying truth for them. Power does not require noise, argument, or domination. It only requires self-possession. It is in these moments of deliberate autonomy that you begin to understand the depth of manipulation that once constrained you. Every slight, every subtle demand, every expectation of immediate response was part of a system designed to extract your energy, to test your limits, and to define your value according to their convenience. And now, by stepping back, by refusing to yield, you reveal the fragility of that system. You expose the illusion that their authority or influence was ever legitimate. It was always contingent on your compliance, and now that compliance is withdrawn. The tension that arises is almost palpable. You feel it in the room, in conversations, in glances that linger too long. People struggle to understand the absence of reaction, the deliberate calm, the refusal to overextend for their comfort. And yet you remain unshaken. You are patient. You are deliberate. You are invisible in your force. Every hesitation they display, every faltering question, every misstep in conversation is proof of the power you now wield. The power of choice, of autonomy, of refusal to exist according to their scripts. Breaking these chains also requires confronting the internalized expectations you once carried. It is not just the world that must adjust, it is you. For years, you were conditioned to believe that your value was tied to compliance, that your purpose was to smooth conflict, that your energy existed for the comfort of others. Every apology, every concession, every softened truth reinforced the illusion that you were obligated to serve the expectations of those around you. And as you begin to reject that conditioning, the transformation is both liberating and disorienting. You must learn to trust yourself, to trust your choices, and to inhabit your autonomy without fear of judgment or guilt. This is the true breakthrough, recognizing that the chains of expectation were never external, they were internalized. The world did not force you to comply, you believed you had to. And the moment you reclaim that belief, the power shifts irreversibly. You no longer act from obligation, from fear, or from a desire to please. You act from principle, from clarity, and from a recognition of your intrinsic value. And the world, unaccustomed to this level of self-possession, responds with disorientation, uncertainty, and in some cases, fear. Freedom, however, is not an absence of consequence. Those who have relied on your compliance will test the limits of your new boundaries. They will attempt to provoke, manipulate, or shame you into reverting to old patterns. But you have learned that true power is in restraint, in observation, in the deliberate choice not to react. The chains can only hold you if you allow them to. The moment you refuse to participate in the system of expectation, the chains crumble, and the weight of autonomy settles fully into your being. And in this newfound freedom, you discover a subtle, devastating strength. By refusing to conform, you force others to confront their own assumptions. By asserting your boundaries, you compel acknowledgement without demand. By existing fully, deliberately, and unshakably, you reveal the fragility of a world built on compliance and predictability. The chains are not just broken, they are exposed for the illusions they always were, and the realization of that truth carries with it a quiet, almost intoxicating power. By the end of this part, one truth stands clear. Expectations only bind those who accept them. Compliance only empowers those who take it for granted. And when you step outside the patterns that once defined you, when you reclaim your energy and autonomy, You wield a force far greater than any argument, confrontation, or act of aggression could produce. The chains of expectation are broken. The world begins to tremble, not at what you do, but at the certainty of who you have become. The deeper you embrace this freedom, the more you begin to understand the subtle, pervasive ways the world resists it. People are conditioned to rely on your predictability, your willingness to accommodate, and your habitual compliance. They do not know how to navigate someone who refuses to exist according to their assumptions. And as you continue to assert your autonomy, you notice a fascinating pattern. Discomfort, hesitation, and even fear arise not from your actions, but from the absence of your reaction. It is not chaos that you introduce, but clarity. The clarity that comes from refusing to participate in their scripts. The clarity that comes from inhabiting your boundaries fully, without compromise or apology. And in this clarity, you discover a power both subtle and profound. People adjust, rethink, and recalibrate their approach, not because you forced them to, but because you revealed a truth they were unwilling to face. Your freedom becomes contagious, exposing the dependency and manipulation that had gone unnoticed for years. Some will resist. Some will attempt to provoke, to manipulate, to coax you back into compliance. They will test limits, press boundaries, and wield their expectations like weapons. And yet you do not yield. You do not rise to the bait. You do not expend energy on proving your autonomy. Instead, you remain deliberate, measured, and unshakable. You have learned that power is not in reaction, but in constancy. The chains can only hold those who accept them, and you have long since refused. As this deliberate resistance continues, you begin to witness the subtle, almost imperceptible shifts in dynamics. Conversations that once flowed predictably now falter. Requests are hesitant, words carefully weighed, gestures tentative. People instinctively recognize the absence of compliance and are forced to adapt. Some succeed, stepping forward with integrity, respect, and genuine intention. Others falter, exposing desperation, dependency, and the fragility of control built on your previous submission. And you, calm and observant, watch the world adjust around the force of your presence, or more precisely, the power of your deliberate absence. There is a subtle satisfaction in seeing the assumptions of the world crumble, but it is tempered with understanding. This is not cruelty, nor is it ego. It is clarity. It is recognition of the patterns that once constrained you, and the conscious decision to no longer participate in them. The chains of expectation do not break in a single moment. They fracture slowly, through countless deliberate choices, small acts of refusal, and persistent self-possession. Each moment compounds, each pause, each withheld word, each unbent boundary building the architecture of a freedom long denied. And the internal transformation is as profound as the external impact. You begin to trust yourself in ways you never did before. You understand that your value is intrinsic, not conditional on the comfort or approval of others. You feel the clarity of self-possession, the quiet strength of autonomy, and the liberating absence of obligation. You no longer define yourself through the eyes of the world, nor do you allow others' expectations to dictate your energy or attention. And in this liberation, the true extent of your power becomes undeniable. Breaking the chains of expectation is not about aggression. It is not about confrontation. It is about deliberate alignment with your own principles, energy, and value. It is about creating space in which the world cannot control you without your consent. And as you inhabit that space fully, the tremors of your autonomy ripple outward. People sense it instinctively, even if they cannot articulate it. They feel the recalibration, the subtle force of self-possession, and the unspoken authority of a life lived on your own terms. By the end of this part, one undeniable truth emerges. Freedom is not granted by others. Autonomy is not a gift. Respect is not automatic. They must all be earned, but the first step in earning them is refusing to surrender them in the first place. When you break the chains of expectation, the world is forced to reckon with a version of you it never anticipated, never controlled, and never contained. And that, more than anything else, is the power of self-possession, quiet, deliberate, and unstoppable. The final stage of breaking the chains of expectation is both subtle and seismic. You realize that the world does not define your worth. It never has. Every demand, every assumption, every unspoken obligation was merely a reflection of the expectations of others, not the measure of your value. And as you release yourself from those bindings, as you refuse to comply with the scripts written by people who never asked for your consent, a profound freedom settles in. You are no longer a character in someone else's story. You are the author of your own. The effects are immediate yet quiet. People notice before they understand. They pause, hesitate, and measure their interactions with you in ways they never did before. Requests that once arrived without question now encounter the invisible barrier of your autonomy. Words that once flowed predictably now falter. And in this disruption, the power of your self-possession becomes evident. It is not loud. It is not dramatic. It is deliberate, precise, and undeniable. You see how deeply the world relied on your compliance, how fragile authority built on your accommodation truly was. Those who attempted to dominate, manipulate, or provoke you now encounter resistance not through confrontation, but through steadfast autonomy. And that resistance, quiet, measured, unyielding, is far more destabilizing than any argument, threat, or conflict ever could be. You have learned that the unseen strength lies not in noise, aggression, or domination, but in consistency, awareness, and refusal to surrender your energy. Breaking the chains also transforms your inner world. The constant second-guessing, the internalized guilt, the habit of apology for simply existing, these slowly dissolve. You begin to inhabit your own presence fully, moving through the world with intention and clarity. You no longer overextend for validation, nor do you compromise for convenience. Your decisions, your attention, your energy all belong to you, and that ownership is both liberating and formidable. The world reacts instinctively. Some resist, some test boundaries. Some falter, exposed in their reliance on your previous predictability. And others, rare and perceptive, recognize the change and adjust, respecting the power of your autonomy without need for control. You observe all of it unshaken, understanding that their reactions are a reflection of your newfound freedom, not a challenge to it. And in this culmination, one truth crystallizes. Breaking the chains of expectation is not an act of rebellion against others. It is an act of allegiance to yourself. It is the deliberate choice to honor your boundaries, reclaim your energy, and demand recognition for your intrinsic value. It is understanding that compliance is not virtue, accommodation is not strength, and sacrifice without reciprocity is not nobility. It is clarity, discipline, and unshakable self-possession. By the end of this chapter, the transformation is complete. You are no longer bound by the invisible rules that once dictated your actions. You are no longer constrained by the assumptions, manipulations, or expectations of the world. You have stepped fully into autonomy, and with it comes a quiet, devastating authority, the knowledge that your presence, your attention, your energy, all are yours to command, to withhold, and to wield as you see fit. The chains are broken, the assumptions are shattered, and the world must reckon with the force of a person who no longer exists according to its rules. The liberation is absolute. The power is unseen, yet undeniable, and the path forward is yours alone. The strategic silence is not simply the absence of noise. It is a force, precise, deliberate, and often misunderstood. The world believes that communication is only measured in words, that influence flows from speech, confrontation, and visible action. But those who have mastered themselves know differently. Silence can shape reality more profoundly than any argument, more devastatingly than any act of aggression. It is the invisible hand that unsettles, the unseen weight that bends perception, the quiet pressure that forces reflection and recalibration. You begin to understand this power when you stop reacting impulsively. Every question, every challenge, every provocation that once demanded immediate attention is now met with deliberate stillness. You pause, you measure, and you withhold, not out of fear, hesitation, or indecision, but out of awareness. And in that pause, the unseen tension grows. People feel it even if they cannot articulate it. They attempt to reclaim control, to provoke, to compel a response, and each failed attempt only strengthens the weight of your silence. This is the essence of strategic silence. It is a weapon of precision, not chaos. It does not escalate, it controls. It does not dominate through volume, it dominates through presence, or more accurately, through the absence of reaction. Each pause becomes a statement. Each withheld word becomes a revelation. Every calculated absence from expectation forces others to confront truths they would rather ignore. Your autonomy, your self-possession, and the futility of trying to manipulate forces beyond their understanding. You notice the subtle, almost imperceptible effects. People hesitate, falter, and overcompensate in the presence of deliberate stillness. They measure every word, test every assumption, and second-guess every move. The tension is palpable not because you act aggressively, but because your restraint is absolute. They have grown accustomed to your compliance, your predictability, your energy flowing freely to serve their assumptions. And now, confronted with the unyielding weight of strategic silence, they are unbalanced. It is not easy to maintain this form of control. Silence requires discipline, awareness, and patience. The instinct to react, to explain, to defend oneself is primal. It whispers that you must justify, that you must engage, that you must assert. And yet the mastery lies in resisting that instinct. Every moment you resist reinforces the power of the unseen. Every deliberate pause, every measured stillness, every unspoken word accumulates like a force field around you, reshaping interactions without a single outward motion. Through strategic silence, you learn to navigate the world with clarity and precision. You begin to observe patterns, motives, and vulnerabilities that were invisible when you were reactive. You notice how people manipulate expectation, weaponize dependency, and take for granted your willingness to respond. And you realize that by withholding reaction, you expose their methods effortlessly. You do not need to accuse, confront, or defend. The silence itself reveals the truth. There is an almost intoxicating clarity in this realization. Words are heavy, explanations are vulnerable, confrontation is exhausting. Silence is neither of these. Silence preserves energy, protects boundaries, and projects power without display. And the world, unaccustomed to this absence, reacts instinctively. Hesitation, overcompensation, and uncertainty become visible in micro-expressions, in faltering speech, in subtle shifts of posture. Your power grows not by acting, but by withholding. Yet, strategic silence is not passive. It is not avoidance. It is a deliberate, conscious choice, a manifestation of control. It is the art of shaping outcomes without seeming to act, of influencing without engaging directly, of commanding without raising your voice. And those who once relied on your compliance find themselves navigating a force they cannot read, manipulate, or predict. Their frustration, confusion, and faltering attempts to regain control only amplify the potency of your restraint. By the end of this first part, the principle is clear. Silence is not emptiness. It is strategy. It is power. It is the unseen weapon that reveals weakness, dismantles manipulation, and commands attention without demand. Those who do not understand it will flounder, stumble, and expose themselves. And you, deliberate in your stillness, occupy a space of influence the world has never known, subtle, precise, and utterly unassailable. As the mastery of strategic silence deepens, you begin to perceive its effects in layers that were previously invisible. Silence is no longer merely a tool. It is a force that shapes the behavior, thoughts, and emotions of those around you. People who once relied on your predictability now stumble over the absence of immediate reaction. They search for patterns, anticipate responses, and measure every word, but the rhythm you once offered is gone. And in that vacuum, the truth of your self-possession emerges, undeniable and disorienting to those who expected compliance. It is fascinating to observe how dependent the world is on reaction. They are trained to push, provoke, and manipulate, assuming that every action will elicit a predictable response. But with strategic silence, that assumption is dismantled. Every attempt to control or provoke you falters. Every subtle manipulation loses its edge. And in those moments, you realize that silence is not a lack. It is a presence far heavier than words, far more precise than argument, far more potent than confrontation. You also begin to understand the subtle psychological pressure that silence creates. It forces reflection, uncertainty, and awareness in ways that noise cannot. People question themselves when you do not respond. They overthink what should have been simple. They measure their intentions against the absence of reaction, and in doing so they reveal truths they would have otherwise concealed. Strategic silence is not aggression, it is revelation. It exposes weakness, dependency, and hidden motives without a single word. This power comes with discipline. The instinct to respond, to explain, defend, or react is strong. Every nerve in your body might scream to justify your choices, to fill the space with your voice, to assert yourself. But the mastery lies in resisting that impulse. Each moment of stillness strengthens your presence, each withheld word compounds your influence, each deliberate pause becomes a statement louder than any argument could be. It is subtle, quiet, and devastatingly effective. You notice patterns forming in the behavior of others. Those who relied on your predictability begin to falter. They hedge their words, overcompensate with gestures, and hesitate where they once commanded. Those who attempted manipulation reveal their strategies unintentionally, and those rare few who act with integrity adjust naturally, respecting the space you have claimed without need for coercion. Every interaction becomes a reflection of the power of deliberate restraint. Strategic silence also refines your own awareness. You learn to read tension in the subtlest expressions, to sense expectation before it is voiced, to anticipate attempts at manipulation before they manifest. This heightened perception allows you to act, or not act, with precision, further amplifying the potency of the unseen weapon. You move through the world with a rhythm unfamiliar to most, guided not by reaction but by deliberate calculation and unshakable presence. And yet silence is not merely defensive. It is transformative. By withholding reaction, you redefine the parameters of interaction. You shift the balance of power without confrontation. You teach the world to acknowledge boundaries it once ignored. You reveal that influence does not require noise, argument, or dominance. It requires awareness, restraint, and the deliberate orchestration of presence and absence. By the end of this part, one undeniable truth emerges. The most devastating weapon is not seen or heard. It is felt. It is the pressure of stillness, the weight of unyielding presence, the quiet authority that forces recognition without demand. Those who once assumed control over you are now confronted with a force they cannot read, manipulate, or predict. And in that confrontation, strategic silence becomes absolute power, quiet, precise, and unstoppable. As strategic silence becomes second nature, you begin to see how it reshapes not just interactions, but entire dynamics. The people around you, once confident in their ability to predict and control your responses, now encounter uncertainty. Their habitual reliance on your compliance falters. Requests that were once effortless are now measured, scrutinized, and sometimes abandoned entirely. Their expectations, carefully constructed over years of your participation, crumble under the quiet weight of your unshakable stillness. The power of this silence is subtle yet profoundly disruptive. It forces reflection, exposes assumptions, and challenges authority without a single word being spoken. People are instinctively drawn to fill the void, to provoke a reaction, to reclaim the rhythm they once dictated. And yet, each attempt only amplifies the tension, revealing their reliance on your previous predictability. Your silence becomes a mirror, reflecting not just their motives, but their insecurities, dependencies, and vulnerabilities. You notice, too, that the world struggles to define you. Those who thrive on labels, judgments, and control cannot categorize a person who does not respond predictably. They measure you against old standards, old expectations, and old patterns, and find them absent. This absence is unsettling. They are forced to confront the unknown, the unpredictable, and the untouchable. And that confrontation is where strategic silence exerts its quiet yet undeniable dominance. There is also an internal evolution that accompanies this mastery. With every moment of withheld reaction, every pause measured and deliberate, your awareness sharpens. You learn to sense manipulation before it is attempted, to read micro-expressions, and to anticipate behavior without relying on words. Your energy is no longer consumed by attempts to appease, explain, or justify. Instead, it is focused, deliberate, and intentionally aligned with your own principles. The silence does not diminish you, it empowers you. Strategic silence is, paradoxically, both invisible and commanding. It does not seek to impress, argue, or dominate overtly. Instead, it operates in the subtle spaces between action and expectation, in the pauses that force reflection, in the absence that speaks volumes. It is a form of authority the world cannot challenge because it cannot touch, predict, or manipulate it. Every hesitation, every faltering word, every subtle misstep from others becomes evidence of its power. And yet this silence is not a weapon wielded for cruelty. It is precise, intentional, and guided by principle. You do not provoke without reason, nor do you retreat out of fear. Each pause, each moment of stillness, each deliberate withholding is a strategic choice designed to preserve autonomy, reveal truth, and shape outcomes subtly but irrevocably. It is influence without display, authority without noise, and power without aggression. By the end of this part, the principle is undeniable. Silence is not weakness. It is not avoidance. It is not passivity. It is strategy, precision, and power. The unseen weight of your presence, combined with deliberate absence, forces recognition, exposes dependency, and shapes behavior in ways the world cannot anticipate. Those who once assumed control over you are now confronted with a reality they cannot manipulate, a reality shaped by quiet, deliberate, and unshakable authority. The culmination of strategic silence is a force both subtle and absolute. By now, you have observed its effects ripple through the world around you. People who once assumed control now hesitate, question, and overcompensate. They search for patterns, attempt manipulation, and test boundaries, but every effort encounters the unyielding wall of your deliberate restraint. They realize, even if unconsciously, that your power lies not in words, aggression, or dominance, but in the quiet mastery of self-possession. You notice the shift in dynamics everywhere, in relationships, in conversations, in workplaces, in social spaces. Those who relied on your predictability are disoriented. Those who attempted to provoke or manipulate falter. And those who act with integrity recognize, without words, the force of someone who no longer exists according to expectation. The silence does not demand respect. It commands it naturally, effortlessly, and irrevocably. This power, however, is not passive. It requires patience, awareness, and unwavering consistency. The instinct to react, explain, or justify is constant, a subtle tug at the edges of your discipline. But with each resisted impulse, the potency of your silence grows. Each measured pause becomes a demonstration of control, a declaration of autonomy, and a reflection of unshakable self-possession. The world feels this authority even when it cannot name it, even when it cannot comprehend it. Strategic silence also transforms your inner world. You become attuned to energy, intent, and subtle shifts in behavior. You learn to anticipate, navigate, and influence without engaging in conflict. Your attention is preserved, your boundaries respected, and your presence becomes an invisible force that shapes outcomes without visible effort. You wield power without aggression, authority without spectacle, and influence without confrontation. The ultimate lesson of this chapter is clear. Silence is more than absence. It is a weapon of precision, a mirror of truth, and a force that exposes weakness while reinforcing autonomy. Those who once manipulated you, provoked you, or tested your limits now confront a reality they cannot control. The balance of power has shifted quietly, irrevocably, and with subtlety that renders their attempts at dominance futile. By the end of this chapter, one truth stands unwavering. The most devastating influence is not loud, visible, or confrontational. It is quiet, deliberate, and unshakable. Strategic silence reshapes the world, exposes intentions, and commands recognition without a single word. It is the unseen weapon, the subtle authority, and the ultimate assertion of self-possession. In this stillness, you discover a force more precise than any confrontation, more effective than any argument, and more permanent than any display of aggression. The world moves around you differently now, not because you demand it, not because you provoke it, but because you exist fully, deliberately, and unshakably in the space that is yours alone. Silence is not weakness. Silence is strategy. Silence is power. The empire of your presence, the world once assumed it could shape you, bend you, and define the limits of your existence. But now, after mastery of silence, autonomy, and deliberate restraint, a new reality emerges. Your presence is sovereign. It is no longer subject to expectation, manipulation, or external definition. Every interaction, every space you occupy, resonates with the weight of someone who exists fully on their own terms. You are no longer a participant in someone else's narrative. You are the architect of your own. Presence is more than visibility. It is the conscious assertion of self, the projection of energy, the unmistakable force that shifts perception without action. When you enter a room, speak a word, or even remain silent, the world bends subtly to your rhythm. People feel the difference immediately. Some falter, unsure of how to engage. Others adjust instinctively, recognizing the authority embedded in your presence. And all of this occurs without argument, without noise, without coercion, simply because you occupy space deliberately and unassailably. The empire of presence is built on layers of mastery. It begins with self-possession, knowing your value, honoring your energy, and refusing to be manipulated. It extends to strategic silence, understanding the power of absence, the force of restraint, and the subtle influence that comes from being deliberate in every interaction. It encompasses the breaking of expectations, rejecting scripts written by others, refusing to surrender autonomy, and asserting boundaries with precision. Each layer compounds the others, creating a force that is both subtle and overwhelming. In this empire, influence does not demand compliance, it earns recognition. People notice before they understand. They pause, measure, and recalibrate in response to your presence. Micro-expressions, tones of voice, gestures, and glances all shift in acknowledgement of the energy you project. And the most profound realization dawns: authority, respect, and power are not conferred, they are sensed. They emanate from someone who inhabits their space fully, moves with intention, and exists without apology. Yet the empire is not built on intimidation or fear. It is anchored in clarity, self-awareness, and discipline. You do not compel others to act, you allow your presence to influence organically. You do not react to provocation, you maintain stillness. You do not argue for recognition, you command it through consistency, autonomy, and deliberate energy. In doing so, you create a space in which the world cannot dictate your value, manipulate your attention, or undermine your influence. Every action within this empire is intentional. Every glance, every pause, every word, or lack thereof, is calibrated to reinforce authority and project sovereignty. People unconsciously respect the rhythm you establish, recognize the boundaries you enforce, and respond to the unspoken force of your presence. And with each interaction, the empire expands, not through conquest, intimidation, or noise, but through the quiet, unyielding assertion of who you are and the unshakable reality that you exist on your own terms. By the end of this first part, one truth becomes undeniable. Presence is the ultimate currency of influence. It transcends words, action, and expectation. It is the weight of self-possession, the resonance of discipline, and the echo of autonomy. And when wielded deliberately, it creates an empire no one can invade, manipulate, or destabilize. The empire of your presence. Within this empire, You begin to perceive the subtle architecture of human interaction in ways that were previously invisible. Every glance, every inflection, every hesitation becomes a map of intention, a reflection of energy, a signpost of influence. People unconsciously reveal their expectations, their dependence, and their vulnerabilities in response to the quiet authority you exude. And in that observation, you realize that your presence alone reshapes dynamics without a single overt action. The power of presence lies not in domination, but in recognition. You no longer need to assert control, you merely exist deliberately. Every step, every pause, every carefully measured word, or the conscious choice not to speak, broadcasts confidence, autonomy, and clarity. Those who once assumed control now navigate uncertainty. They hesitate where they once commanded. They falter where they once dictated. And the subtle authority of your presence becomes the unseen force that redefines every interaction. This empire is reinforced by the mastery of silence and strategic restraint. The world expects reaction. It thrives on the habitual response of others. But when you withhold reaction, when you resist provocation, when you refuse to fulfill expectations imposed upon you, you destabilize the patterns that once controlled the environment. The absence of compliance is more influential than any confrontation, more powerful than any argument, more permanent than any assertion. Strategic silence does not merely protect, it transforms. Within this transformative space, you also discover the ability to shape outcomes without conflict. By observing rather than reacting, you anticipate motives, recognize manipulation, and navigate tensions with precision. Your energy is preserved, your influence is heightened, and the world adjusts organically to your presence. People recognize your authority instinctively, even if they cannot articulate it. And that recognition, silent and unspoken, becomes the currency that fuels the empire you now inhabit. The empire of presence extends beyond immediate interactions. It permeates relationships, professional spaces, and social dynamics alike. The subtle shift in energy changes expectations, alters behavior, and redefines influence in ways that are both profound and irreversible. Those who once relied on compliance find themselves recalibrating, adjusting, and acknowledging your autonomy. Those who act with integrity are drawn toward alignment, and those who attempt manipulation are exposed, powerless against a force they cannot touch or predict. As the empire solidifies, one principle emerges with clarity. Influence does not require noise, argument, or aggression. It requires discipline, self-possession, and deliberate energy. It requires the mastery of presence, the strategic use of silence, and the unwavering commitment to inhabit your space fully and unapologetically. Those who understand this power can wield it to shape reality, command respect, and build a life defined not by the expectations of others, but by their own deliberate design. By the end of this part, it becomes evident that the empire is not external. It is internal, yet its effects are visible everywhere. Your presence creates a gravitational field around your energy. People move, react, and adjust within it. They sense authority, clarity, and autonomy. And the world, unaccustomed to such force, bends subtly, inevitably, and irrevocably. The empire is built not with conquest, but with mastery of self, the ultimate and unassailable form of power. The empire of your presence, as the empire of your presence grows, you begin to notice a profound shift not only in others, but within yourself. You no longer measure value by approval, recognition, or validation from the external world. Those metrics are obsolete because your authority, your influence, and your sovereignty are intrinsic. Presence becomes a state of being, a continuous assertion of self that does not fluctuate based on circumstance, opinion, or external expectation. You exist fully, deliberately, and unapologetically, and that constancy is both unsettling and magnetic to those around you. The world reacts instinctively. People who once took advantage of your compliance falter, uncertain how to engage. They attempt to provoke, manipulate, or test boundaries, only to discover that your energy is untouchable. Every attempt at control meets a calm, deliberate presence that cannot be swayed, shaken, or exploited. This is the essence of authority: influence without coercion, power without aggression, and command without argument. It is a force recognized instinctively, felt physically, yet impossible to resist. In this stage, you also understand the full magnitude of restraint. The empire of presence is not loud. It does not rely on spectacle. It is not measured in the volume of words or the aggression of action. Instead, it exists in deliberate stillness, in calculated absence, in the quiet strength of self-possession. People respond to this mastery unconsciously. They overthink, hesitate, and recalibrate their behavior because they sense a force they cannot control. That realization, silent, invisible, undeniable, reinforces the unshakable authority of your presence. Presence also becomes a lens through which you perceive the intentions, weaknesses, and dependencies of others. You no longer react impulsively or emotionally. Instead, you observe with clarity, understanding the subtle cues, hidden motives, and unspoken dynamics that shape interactions. This heightened perception amplifies your influence because it allows you to act, or refrain from acting, with precision. The world moves in response not to noise or pressure, but to the deliberate calibration of your energy. And yet the empire is not wielded for domination. It is exercised with intention, discernment, and principle. Every pause, every measured word, every step you take or choose not to take is deliberate. You project authority without intimidation, influence without force, and power without spectacle. The world, unaccustomed to this level of mastery, reacts instinctively, revealing its reliance on patterns, expectations, and compliance that no longer exist. By the end of this part, one truth crystallizes with undeniable clarity. The empire of your presence is the ultimate expression of mastery. It is the culmination of autonomy, strategic silence, and the breaking of expectation. It is influence that transcends argument, authority that surpasses coercion, and power that flows naturally from the deliberate inhabitation of your own energy. The world recognizes it, even if it cannot articulate it. It bends to it subtly, irrevocably, and silently. The empire of your presence, the ultimate realization of the empire of presence is this. Influence is not given, it is sensed. Respect is not demanded, it is acknowledged. Power is not taken, it is emanated. The world responds to those who exist deliberately, fully, and unapologetically in their own authority. By mastering autonomy, strategic silence, and the rejection of expectation, you have constructed a force field around your energy, an empire that cannot be invaded, manipulated, or undermined. Every interaction now resonates with the weight of your mastery. People pause, measure, and reconsider because they sense the presence of someone who cannot be swayed by triviality, provocation, or expectation. Those who once attempted to control you are disarmed by subtlety. Those who relied on manipulation or predictability falter and reveal themselves. And those who approach with integrity are drawn toward alignment, naturally respecting the boundaries, energy, and authority you embody. This empire is not external, it exists within you. Every boundary you enforce, every moment of strategic silence, every deliberate choice to inhabit your energy fully expands it. Influence flows effortlessly because it is rooted in self-possession, not coercion. Authority is recognized because it is consistent, not performative. And power is undeniable because it is invisible, precise, and deliberate. Those who understand its weight sense it immediately. Those who do not stumble, falter, and recalibrate unconsciously. Presence in this form becomes the most devastating force you can wield. It does not need confrontation to assert itself. It does not require noise to command attention. It does not rely on aggression to inspire fear. Its potency lies in subtlety, in consistency, in unshakable self-possession. The world moves differently around you because you exist fully, deliberately, and autonomously, and that alone reshapes reality. And so the empire is complete, not built with conquest, intimidation, or argument, but through the deliberate mastery of self. Autonomy, strategic silence, and deliberate presence converge into a force that is unseen, unchallenged, and unstoppable. The world, once confident in its ability to define you, now exists within the boundaries you set. It bends subtly, inevitably, and irreversibly to the power you emanate, not because you demand it, but because you embody it. By the end, one undeniable truth stands. The most profound power is internal, silent, and deliberate. It requires no spectacle, no confrontation, no argument. It exists in presence, restraint, and self-mastery. And those who understand this force wield not just influence, but sovereignty over their own lives, energy, and reality. The empire of your presence is absolute, and the world cannot touch it, challenge it, or diminish it, because it resides entirely within you. The journey ends here, but the force you have become continues. Deliberate, unyielding, and sovereign, your presence is an empire built not of walls or armies, but of energy, silence, and mastery, the ultimate authority over yourself and the world around you.